Chapter 229. Ignoring the bustle in the wilderness, Ning Ke returned to the camp with Cat Girl. He lifted the curtain and walked into the tent. He glanced at the luggage piled in the corner and looked at Mo Shanshan, who was concentrating on writing calligraphy. He asked, "Wasn't my black horse tied outside the tent? Why did it slip out?" Mo Shanshan put down the brush in her hand and looked back at him. She explained expressionlessly, "You tied it up after it came back in the morning. After you left, I was the only one left in the tent. It kept barking and kicking its hooves. It looked like it wanted to go out to play, so I untied the rope and let it play on its own." Ning Ke looked at her and didn't know what to say. He scratched his head and said, "You let it go when it wanted to go out. Why does this sound wrong? It's a horse, not a human. The big black horse is very intelligent. I can understand what it wants to say." After saying this, Mo Shanshan didn't want to explain more about this matter. She turned around and picked up the brush on the inkstone, ready to continue copying. Cat Girl ran to her excitedly and said, "Senior sister, you are right. The big black horse is more than intelligent. So powerful. Do you know that many people are chasing after it?" Mo Shanshan slightly raised her black eyebrows and asked, "What happened?" Cat Girl carefully told the process of the big black horse's appearance and winning the horse race. Then she said, "As for what happened in the end, senior brother covered my eyes, so I didn't see it." Mo Shanshan looked at Ning Quebec. Ning Ke wondered how he should describe that scene. He raised his hand to cover his mouth and coughed twice. He pretended not to see Mo Shanshan's gaze and walked out of the tent. Standing on the slightly hard winter wilderness and looking at the fluttering flag of the Tang army and the heavily guarded camp not far from the west, he began to think about other problems. Where should he start to find the head of the horse gang? As the representative of the Tang Empire in this negotiation, General Xu Chang brought his trusted subordinates and traveled thousands of miles from Chang unto this place. The safety of the 300 elite cavalrymen of the Northeast Border Military was in charge of the security. Banners fluttered in the wind and the occasional neighing of horses could be heard. The tents were arranged in an orderly manner and the Tang camp was densely packed. In the tent in the center of the Tang camp, General Xu Chang took off his helmet and carelessly stroked his gray hair. He sat behind the table and signaled his subordinates to prepare some food. He drank a lot in the king's tent, but he could not eat his fill. General Xu held his fork and food as he ate, remaining silent. The subordinate next to him noticed that the general was deep in thought. He thought that the general was in a bad mood after hearing some gossip about today's horse race. After thinking for a while, he comforted, "General, our cavalry is good at fighting. We are really not good at this kind of pure racing. If we lost, we lost. If that old aunt wants to gossip, no one can stop her. That old woman doesn't know shit," General Xu said mockingly. As a general of the Tang Empire, he had to be careful with his words when he respected Kunimati as the sister of the Yueluan Kingdom's king. But in this private military tent, he was not in the mood to give that aunt any face. Seeing that the general was really not upset about this matter, the subordinate thought of another matter. He glanced at the patrolling soldiers outside the tent and asked in a low voice, "General, are you worried about Tuyang City?" In the summer, the imperial court confirmed that the matter of assisting the Northern Yen expedition would be presided over by the Tang Empire's Eastern Army General Xiahou. But no one would have thought that when the Central Plains began to negotiate with the grassland barbarians, His Majesty had already ordered the military ministry to intervene in this matter. Although General Xu Chang came to the palace on imperial orders, it inevitably angered the border military. When he passed by Tuyang City, General Xiahou used the excuse of patrolling the border, and did not even want to see him. "If I were General Xiahou, I would not be happy either." General Xu Chang smiled slightly and put down the chopsticks in his hand. He took the towel and wiped his face casually. He said, "Don't guess blindly. I am indeed thinking about something, but it has nothing to do with the two things you guessed." The subordinate frowned slightly and thought that the two sides had reached an agreement. The next thing to do was to discuss the northern expedition next year with the Central Plains Coalition Army, and the specific matters of assisting the Lieutenant Palace. Everything would be done naturally. If the general was not upset about losing the horse race and not worried about the anger of Tuyang City, then what was he thinking about? I am thinking about the big black horse, General Shucheng said with a smile. The subordinate suddenly understood and thought that he finally understood the general's thoughts. After a moment of thought he said, Chan Yu seems to be very interested in that fine horse. But since the general likes it, I will think of some ways to inform the steward of the king's tent later. I believe that Chan Yu will not be stingy with the horse to show his closeness to the Tang Empire. General Shu Cheng looked at the subordinate and sighed helplessly. He scolded, I don't know what is going on in your head. I don't want the big black horse. If Chan Yu wants the horse, he will only get into trouble in the end. Looking at the confused expression on the subordinate's face, the general shook his head and looked at the blue sky outside the tent. He frowned slightly and said, When I saw the big black horse today, I felt that it was a little familiar. I always felt that I had seen it somewhere before. General Shu Cheng threw the towel on the table and said with a reminiscing expression, At that moment, I just remembered that I had seen the big black horse in the driving examination last spring when I represented the military ministry to inspect the academy entrance examination of the academy. The subordinate was stunned. He thought of the black lightning running in the wilderness and the violent black storm. He thought that the incredible horse actually came from the Tang Empire? You also saw how hot-tempered the big black horse was. During the academy entrance examination last spring, all the candidates who were chosen to ride the big black horse fell off, including the daughter of General Yun Hui. I was patrolling above the meadow at that time and thought that no one could tame the horse. Then I saw a lad walk into the stud field. General Shu Cheng squinted slightly and recalled the scene at that time. He said slowly, The big black horse suddenly became very obedient in front of the lad. I thought it was a little strange at that time, but when the lad's name shook Chong and City, I realized that the warhorse was actually very intelligent. It actually knew the lad's power before anyone else. The subordinate asked curiously, Who is that lad? The general withdrew his gaze and looked at him. He said, Ningquebec Ningke. The subordinate murmured. Suddenly he looked shocked and said in surprise, Are you talking about Sir Ning, who shot Chong, and with a piece of paper? I don't like to play with words. General Shu sighed and said, I only know that Ning Ke entered the academy last year and entered the second floor this year. He has become a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. I also know that when Ning Ke left Chong and City, the stud field in the suburb specially sent this big black horse to him. The subordinate asked, Then, why did this big black horse appear in the palace? As soon as the words left his mouth, he knew that he had asked a very stupid question. Such an unparalleled horse would naturally not be too far away from its master. If the horse was in the palace, it would naturally be in the palace. Ordinary people don't know that Ning Ke is ranked 13th on the second floor of the academy. But of course the military ministry knows that he used the name of Mr. 13 and stayed at the frontier fortress of north of Yan Kingdom. But even I did not expect him to personally come to the palace. General Shu frowned slightly and said to himself in a low voice, Even the academy attaches so much importance to this peace conference. Are the desolate men in the north really so troublesome? Or is there another secret about this matter? The subordinate thought for a moment and asked puzzledly, General, since Ning Ke has come to the palace, why did he not show himself or come to the camp to meet you? General Shu was silent for a moment and said with a smile, What kind of person is the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy? He must have his reasons for not showing himself. I probably don't have that much influence. I just feel that this matter is getting more and more interesting. Dusk fell. The bonfire was lit and the sheep were hung upside down. As the aroma of wine filled the air, night fell upon the wilderness. People from all over the world gathered in the palace tribe. There were also many herdsmen from the surrounding tribes who had specially come to participate in the Gu Mumu gathering. Under the light of the fire and the aroma of wine, people excitedly discussed the scenes they had seen during the day. They argued about which warriors were the most powerful and whose archery skills were the best. Of course, the one that was most mentioned was the violent black horse. Countless people were guessing who its owner was. The owner of the big black horse did not hear the excited discussions of the people. He did not enjoy the wine and meat. Instead, he stole the clothes of a herdsman from the grassland. Under the cover of the night, he snuck west from the great river camp and approached the Tang camp silently. He then turned south and sat down behind a high ground. After some time, a figure approached from the direction of the Tang camp. From his speed and body shape, it could be seen that this person was extremely cautious and vigilant. I've never understood. How can you be so sure that it's one of our people coming by drawing a picture with a wooden stick outside the camp? What if it's just a random drawing by the children on the grassland? Ninkei looked at the man and said. Although there was no fire behind the meadow, he could still vaguely make out the man's face and attire under the starry sky. He looked like an honest Tang cavalryman. The Tang soldier did not answer his question. His eyes were filled with suspicion, as if he did not understand why this fellow would have the leisure to say such nonsense under such circumstances. Ninkei stretched out his hand, and the Tang soldier stretched out his hand as well. They seemed to be shaking hands, but with a light snap, the two waist tokens were gently put together, exactly the same. With the help of the starlight, the Tang soldier clearly saw the lines on Ninkei's waist token. His expression suddenly changed, and he hurriedly saluted with hands folded in front. He lowered his voice and said respectfully, I didn't expect His Excellency to come in person. You don't know who I am. How do you know that I'm His Excellency? Ninkei asked with a smile. The Tang soldier's honest face revealed a simple and honest smile. He said, It's written clearly on the waist token that His Excellency is a visiting professor of the administration. Of course he's my Excellency. Ninkei glanced at the man and asked in surprise, The Imperial Center Administration is a government office for cultivation. But I don't see any fluctuation of psyche power on you. Have you entered the see-through state? If I were a powerhouse in the see-through state, I wouldn't have to go through so much trouble to follow you to the wilderness. The Tang soldier laughed and explained, Although the Imperial Center Administration is responsible for managing cultivators, not all the staff are cultivators. There are more ordinary people like me. The reason why Ninkei left the Blue Water Battalion and went deep into the wilderness was because of the message sent by the Nation Master Li Qingshan through the Imperial Center Administration. The Imperial Center Administration would certainly find a way to leave an informant for him near the palace if they wanted to cooperate with him. He looked at the man and said, Let's cut to the chase. Let's get down to business. The Tang soldier answered with a simple and honest smile, If His Excellency wants to chat, we can chat. If he wants to get down to business, we can get down to business. Ninkei was slightly startled. He smiled and thought that the man was indeed a member of the Imperial Center Administration. He probably had too much contact with those arrogant cultivators, so he didn't have the usual respect and awe ordinary people had for cultivators. But his words and actions were so smooth and free. This kind of attitude was really good to use to deal with cultivators. He asked directly, Do you know my task this time? The Tang soldier answered honestly, No. Ninkei nodded and said, That's good. Because what I want to ask has nothing to do with the task. This time it was the Tang soldier's turn to be startled. His honest face showed an expression of admiration. He thought that Ninkei was indeed a distinguished visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration. He could make such a shameless request of using the power of the Imperial Court for his personal affairs so naturally. Ninkei continued to ask, How many people are there in the Tang battalion? About 500 people, including cavalrymen and some handymen. Ninkei looked at the Tang battalion with fluttering flags and dense tents. He frowned and said, It seems that there are more people in the camp. The Tang soldier explained, One person rides 3 horses, so we need more space. How well do you know the situation in the camp? Ninkei asked casually. He thought that there were hundreds of cavalrymen in the Tang battalion, and the man was just an ordinary cavalryman. How could he know everything? However, he did not expect that this Tang cavalryman was a spy placed in the northeast border military by the Imperial Center Administration. What he did every day was to observe any movement in the Tang battalion. So when he heard Ninkei's question, he nodded without hesitation and answered, I have a basic grasp of it. Ninkei glanced at him and thought that he was really lucky. He asked, Is there any special situation in the camp in the last 5 days? For example, are there any injured cavalrymen, or even generals? The Tang soldier thought for a while and shook his head. No. Ninkei said after a moment of silence, Is there anything worth paying attention to in the logistics of food and medicine? The Tang soldier was about to answer no when he suddenly thought of something. He frowned and thought carefully for a while. Then he said, there is indeed something. The consumption of food in a tent seems to be a lot more than usual. This is not surprising. But there is also some problem with the storage of medicine in the camp. Before Ninkei could continue to ask, he added, the military medicine is the focus of the department, so I think there is something wrong. The medicine that is consumed for no reason are not only the medicine for hemostasis and muscle regeneration, but also some powder to calm the mind. But these medicines should not be used these days. Hearing this, Ninkei's eyes gradually brightened. He knew that his guess seemed to be in the right direction. He looked at the brightly lit Tang battalion and asked, where is that tent? Can you find out who is in it? This time, the 300 cavalrymen who escorted General Xu into the wilderness are all from Tuyang City. That tent belongs to a deputy general of the Northern Army in the east. It is heavily guarded. An ordinary cavalryman like me can't even get close. Ninkei frowned slightly. His eyes slowly swept across the continuous tents, as if he wanted to see the military tent. He said, since it is so heavily guarded, is there any way to sneak in and take a look? The Tang soldier did not even think about it. He shook his head and said, unless you break in. Then he looked at Ninkei and added very seriously, sir, although you are a respected foreign official and have a strong state, I am afraid there will be some problems if you break in. Even if you can break in, many people in the camp will die. How will you explain it to the imperial court afterwards? Since there was no way to sneak in, the only way was to break in. However, although he was now a student of the academy, he still regarded himself as a member of the imperial army. He would never take the initiative to fight against his fellow soldiers, so he had to think of another way. Taking advantage of the quiet night and the sparse stars, the guy who was placed in the Northern Army by the Imperial Center Administration sneaked back to the Tang Battalion. Only Ninkei was left behind on the meadow. The sparse yellow grass on the cold ground looked like the beard of a malnourished old man. Ninkei lay on the sparse grass and looked at the stars in the night sky above his head. No one knew what he was thinking. A shadow suddenly covered the starry sky above his head, as if the dark night had come. Ninkei looked at the black horse's face close to him. He looked at its thick lips that seemed to be trying to please him. He could not help but scold it with a smile. The whole palace wants to catch you, and you still dare to come back to see me. The big black horse gently arched his shoulder. It looked extremely docile and even a little quiet, as if it was telling him that as long as he was not angry, it did not matter what others said to it. Ninkei stood up and patted off the sand and grass on his back. He gently punched the big black horse's neck and shook his head. He lectured, people are afraid of being famous, while pigs are afraid of being fat. People are afraid of trouble when they are famous, and pigs are easy to be killed for meat when they are fat. Why do you have to be in the limelight? Aren't you afraid that you will be snatched away when you are too famous? The big black horse shook its head and opened its mouth. Its white teeth looked a little creepy under the starlight, as if it was sneering. It was indescribably cold, arrogant, and stupid. Ninkei stared at its eyes and sneered. Do you mean that even if you are snatched away, you will be treated like a treasure and will not be ordered around like an invincible horse like me? The big black horse gently kicked its hooves and silently dug the floating soil on the wilderness. It cautiously used silence to represent its admission. Ninkei sneered and pointed at the middle of its two strong hind legs. He said, I don't know why the Southern Army didn't castrate you, nor did they castrate you in the field. I also don't know how you escaped the fate of being a eunuch. But you should know very well that I have no intention of castrating you. But my kindness does not mean that everyone else is. With your bad temper, do you really think that you can keep your precious eggs if you fall into the hands of Chanyu or the princess? A cold winter wind blew over the meadow. Fear suddenly appeared in the big black horse's black eyes. It was unknown whether it was because of the cold or something else, but it quickly clamped its hind legs together. However, because of its huge and powerful buttocks, it could not completely clamp them together. Ninkei used the dark night to complete another spy contact in his life. He sorted out the situation of the Tang army and took the time to educate the big black horse. He did so many things. There were countless bonfires on the meadow. In the tents of the palace it was as if it was daytime, but the people only did one thing, and that was to drink. The wilderness was like heaven in spring, but it was as miserable and unbearable as the underworld in midwinter. The cold wind howled and snowflakes fell at any time. It was extremely cold, so the people who lived here liked to drink to warm themselves up, especially hard liquor. The people of the Central Plains and the grassland barbarians beside the bonfire had been constantly fighting over trade and war for 1,000 years. The invasion of the borders not long ago and the counterattack by the Central Plains allied forces after that had caused many casualties on both sides. How could the hatred formed by blood naturally disappear just because the higher-ups had reached an agreement? With complicated emotions, the people of the palace tribe began to compete in drinking with the people of the Central Plains. The alcohol entered their stomachs and did not dispel their hatred. Instead, it magnified their emotions. As a result, the drinking competition became a competition, and the competition became a brawl. The soldiers of the palace and the divine hall, who were in charge of maintaining order, had to rush to another place after quelling a fight. The scene was extremely chaotic. There were a few tents set up at the edge of the meadow. They were very close to the Tang army, but not within the range of the Tang army. They were not affected by the chaos around the bonfires and were still exceptionally quiet, just like the people who lived there. The girls from the Great River Kingdom saw many new and interesting things at the Gumumu gathering. They were quiet and composed, so they returned to the campsite in the evening. Emo Shanshan sat quietly in her tent for an entire day. White paper was spread out on the table, and she hung her wrist over it, copying something. It was as if she did not know the meaning of boredom. At this moment the tent flap was lifted. Zhuo Zhihua walked in with a young girl. She looked at Emo Shanshan and said gently, "Hill Master, a guest has come to visit." Emo Shanshan slowly stopped writing. She put the brush into a jar of clear water and turned around. The young girl was wearing the uniform of the Revelation Institute of the Divine Hall, but there was an unconcealable pride in her eyes. She had been looking around since she entered the tent, trying her best to look calm. But when she saw the young girl in white beside the table turn around, she still felt a little nervous. Because this was the first time she had seen the legendary calligraphy addict. Emo Shanshan looked at her indifferently and said, "Who are you?" The calligraphy addict was used to speaking in such a direct tone. She did not like to talk nonsense. She was used to looking indifferent because she felt that it was very difficult to make an expression. She was used to looking disrespectful because her eyes were not very good. But just like Ning Kei, who did not know that someone had an eye disease, the female student of the Revelation Institute also felt that she had been severely underestimated and even humiliated. Her nervousness became a little irritated, but she still did not dare to be rude. Again, this was the first time she had seen the legendary calligraphy addict. The calligraphy addict was proud and rude. To the students of the Revelation Institute who had always been with another addict, it was easy to understand and accept. The female student of the Revelation Institute bowed respectfully and said, "Princess Chanjia invites senior sister Emo for a chat tomorrow." Emo Shanshan looked at her quietly and thought of her old friend whom she had not seen for a long time. She thought of her old friend who was as calm as an orchid in the horse carriage above the meadow. After a moment of silence she said, "I understand. Tonight, please do not talk to me about quality. It will be changed in the future. Tonight, please talk to me about dreams and about the honor of my father's generation. I do not believe that honor is my life. But the honor of my family seems to be taking my life." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 230. Everything in the world, be it human or emotional life, was most afraid of comparison. The girls from the Great River Kingdom chose a flat ground outside of the Tang camp to camp. Although it was a little cold and cheerless, they felt that it was quiet and not too dissatisfied. However, when they walked into the gorgeous tent where the students of the Revelation Institute were, no matter how tranquil they were, they could not help but feel a little sad when they saw the array equipment and exquisite food. They were all young people who came under the edict of the West Hill Divine Palace. Why did the disciples of the Black Ink Garden not have a good camp in the military camp of the north of Yen Kingdom? They took on a difficult task and risked their lives to come to the palace, but they still did not have a good camp. But these students of the Revelation Institute had such good treatment when they came to the palace, humming and drinking tea. Especially when they recalled the bloody battle with the horse gang under the meadow, they thought that when they and the others were struggling in the camp and could die at any time, the students of the Revelation Institute were coldly watching from their mounts above the meadow. The girls of the Great River Kingdom found it more and more difficult to accept and were unusually depressed. The students of the Revelation Institute sitting opposite them were not sad, nor were they in low spirits. There was no shame on their faces for the robbery by the horse gang. They slowly drank the tea from the precious porcelain bowls in the wilderness and did their duty as hosts to talk gently with the girls of the Great River Kingdom. There was a faint sense of superiority in their words. The Revelation Institute was the research academy of Haotian Taoism. It was personally taught by the West Hill Divine Palace's divine priest. For thousands of years it had cultivated many famous bigwigs. In recent years the Tao addict Yi Hongyu and Prince Long Qing, who were the priests of the judicial department of the Divine Hall, were well-known powerhouses. In the hearts of these young disciples, other than the academy in the south of Chang, there was no other place in the world that could be compared to the Revelation Institute. The girls of the Great River Kingdom suppressed their discomfort and hatred. The students of the Revelation Institute only cared about showing their demeanor and pride. Naturally, it was impossible for them to agree with each other. But there was no conflict because of this. They just gradually stopped talking and only talked to their own sect, as if they could not see each other. In any case, they were not the main characters today. The real main characters had already entered the depths of the tent. The conversation between the two girls behind the magnificent screen was the most important matter of the day. Ning Ke, who was wearing the disciple uniform of Black Ink Garden, was sitting on a chair below. He leaned sideways and whispered something to Cat Girl. From time to time, Cat Girl's innocent and lovely face showed a strange and excited expression. Her little hand gently stroked a square box beside her, looking extremely cautious. Could this be a gift from the calligraphy addict, Mo Shanshan, to the flower addict Lu Qinjia? There were countless beauties in the world, but only 3 were famous. According to the gossip of the world, the flower addict Lu Qinjia, the princess of the Yueluan kingdom, the calligraphy addict Mo Shanshan, the last female disciple of the master of calligrapher of the Great River Kingdom, and the Tao addict Yi Hongyu of the judicial department of West Hill were known as the 3 addicts of the world. The beauty in everyone's eyes was different. Naturally, there was no such thing as the most beautiful person in the world. The reason why there were the 3 fanatics in the world was because these 3 girls were obsessed with a certain realm. Their cultivation realms were profound, and they had powerful backgrounds. Behind the magnificent screen in the depths of the tent, Mo Shanshan looked expressionlessly at the beautiful girl in a light yellow slanted shirt. She said, "You were on the meadow that day." Lu Qinjia was diligently trimming the branches and leaves of an exotic 7-petal flower. When she heard this, she raised her head and smiled. She said, "This is the flower that the princess treasures. It's a pity that she didn't raise it properly. The roots have no spirit, and the flower naturally has no soul when it blooms. So pale that it hurts." The princess of the Yueluan kingdom had loved flowers since she was young. Before she met the perfect man in the palace, flowers were everything to her. They were even more important than her own life. Because of her love affair with Prince Long Qing and her love for flowers, everyone in the world knew of her reputation. However, when people talked about her, they could not help but talk about her appearance first. The flower addict Lu Qinjia was very beautiful. Her eyelashes and brows were all beautiful. She looked beautiful from every angle. She was like a meticulously cultivated flower, its petals trembling in the spring breeze. Sometimes it was budding, sometimes it was blooming, and sometimes it was shy. She was beautiful. The calligraphy addict, Mo Shanshan, was completely different from her. Her eyebrows were thin and thick, as if they were drawn by an ink brush. Although her gaze was unfocused, it was truly clear without any distractions. Her lips were pressed into a line, and her slightly round cheeks did not seem to have the characteristics of a traditional beauty. However, when these seemingly ordinary details were put together, no matter how dull her expression was, she still looked very beautiful. This was what Ning Ke thought when he first saw her. No other adjectives could describe the appearance of this girl from the Great River Kingdom. They might even seem redundant. He could only praise her as beautiful. This kind of beauty was not as moving and clear as Lu Chunjia's beauty. However, because it did not have any lethality, it would not be a burden to anyone's eyes. Instead, it would make the viewer feel relaxed. This kind of beauty could be looked at properly. There was no emotion on Mo Shanshan's beautiful face. She looked at Lu Chunjia and said calmly, "Since you admit that you were on the meadow at that time, then there is nothing more to say about this matter." Lu Chunjia looked at her quietly and smiled. "Sister Mo, do you want to ask me something? You admit it so calmly. Why ask again? But since you insist, I will ask." Mo Shanshan's expression was very calm. One could not tell if she was angry or happy. She said as if she was talking about someone else, "Since you were in the horse carriage on the meadow at that time, you naturally knew that the camp below was being surrounded by the horse gang. You should also know that there were disciples of the Black Ink Garden in the camp. Why did you not let the cavalrymen of Divine Hall come to help?" Lu Chunjia pursed her lips slightly and said, "After entering the wilderness, I was just an ordinary student of the Revelation Institute. How could I order the cavalrymen of Divine Hall?" Mo Shanshan looked at her indifferently, as if she was looking at the pot of flowers in front of her. She said, "If you were just an ordinary student of the Revelation Institute, you should be waiting outside at this time. How could you be qualified to sit and talk to me?" Lu Chunjia frowned slightly. She felt that the girl in white in front of her was very different from the calligraphy addict in her memories. Mo Shanshan did not care about what she was thinking and continued coldly, "The cavalrymen of Divine Hall are under the jurisdiction of the Judicial Department. You are Long Qing's fiancé. Why would they dare to disobey your orders?" She looked at Lu Chunjia and said indifferently, "If you do not want to talk about what happened on the meadow that day, then I will not. Since you want to talk about it, then don't spout nonsense. You are the flower addict, not an idiot." Lu Chunjia still did not speak. She slowly put down the small scissors in her hand and focused on Mo Shanshan opposite her. A trace of a smile appeared in her eyes. She thought to herself what had caused the calligraphy addict to change so much. Mo Shanshan's accusations were not very sharp. Anyone could understand what had happened on the meadow that day. No matter how silent or what, the flower addict, Lu Chunjia, had to bear the responsibility. Lu Chunjia did not care about these accusations. She was more concerned about Mo Shanshan's current behavior. According to her memory and the knowledge of the world, the calligraphy addict was someone who knelt in front of brush, ink, paper and inkstone all day long. She did not care about the affairs of the world and would not speak her mind because she thought it was troublesome. She was extremely quiet and quiet. She had thought that since she invited Mo Shanshan to meet today, no matter how angry she was over the horse gang, she would not criticize her face to face. She did not expect Mo Shanshan to be so direct and tough. Lu Chunjia looked at her quietly. After a long silence, she said, "Sister Mo, you have changed. You have become much more direct and mean. I am very surprised and surprised." Mo Shanshan thought about it seriously for a moment and replied, "I did not know that being direct would sometimes have an effect of being mean." Lu Chunjia looked at her and sighed softly. She smiled bitterly and said, "I did not expect that even you have changed." Mo Shanshan replied calmly, "I have learned many things from someone recently. I am getting used to this change." Lu Chunjia was silent for a moment and asked softly, "Did you come today to criticize me?" Mo Shanshan replied calmly and firmly, "If I did not come to criticize you, why would I come to see you?" Lu Chunjia sighed and said, "I only knew that you were under the meadow when you used the half-divine talisman." Mo Shanshan looked at her beautiful face and paused for a moment before saying, "Even if I was not under the meadow, there would be others under the blades of the horse gang." Lu Chunjia said calmly, "I know you and I admire you. So your life and death are related to me. If you die, I will be sad. The life and death of others have nothing to do with me. Naturally, I will not care." Mo Shanshan said, "I have a junior brother who died in the last attack of the horse gang." Lu Chunjia's tone was still calm. "I do not know your junior brother. So his life and death have nothing to do with me." Mo Shanshan looked at the precious flower tree beside her quietly and said, Most people in the world have nothing to do with you and me. But this world has something to do with you and me. Because sorrow and joy are always interlinked. The sorrow and joy of humans are never interlinked. Lu Chunjia raised her beautiful face and said, "Why do people like you and me have to share the sorrow and joy of the people in the dirty world? Other than flowers and a few people, there is nothing clean in the world. But you and I are clean. If you and I care about the dirty world, we will be dragged into the dust one day. What does the sorrow and joy of the world have to do with me?" Emo Shanshan's eyes drooped slightly. She looked at the mud stains on the bottom of her white dress. After a moment of silence, she raised her head and looked at her quietly. She said, "Ever since I was young, I could not win against you in an argument. I will not pretend to be a simple, sweet, and quiet orchid in front of others. So I do not want to talk to you anymore." Lu Chunjia looked at her and said emotionally, "You are being mean again. This is not good." Emo Shanshan replied calmly, "I am not being mean enough because you are not angry." Lu Chunjia frowned slightly and asked, "Why do you want to make me angry?" Emo Shanshan said, "Because I am angry because you do not know the reason why others are angry but do not care about it. It is also because I was angry under the meadow that day." There was silence in the depths of the magnificent tent. The long silence caused an inexplicable pressure to slowly surround them. The vines on the screen seemed to be about to be broken by this pressure. After some time, Lu Chunjia looked at her calmly and said, "I want to know how you will make me angry." Emo Shanshan said, "You should have known since young that I am not good with words. I have spent my entire life in front of paper and ink, so I am used to fighting. If I completely defeat you, I wonder if you will be angry?" Lu Chunjia smiled slightly. She was like a water lily in a pond in the morning that was suddenly woken up by the chirping of a few birds. She slowly began to bloom its beautiful petals. It was so beautiful and quiet that one could not feel any hostility or desire to fight. The flower addict was the flower addict. She was infatuated with love, infatuated with her own knowledge and thoughts. She did not want to fight Emo Shanshan, so she did not prepare to do so. She only smiled quietly at Emo Shanshan. Facing such a beautiful girl who was smiling calmly at them, most people in the world, no matter how strong a cultivator's heart was, would not know what to do next. Did they really have to throw a punch? However, Emo Shanshan was the calligraphy addict. She had her own obsession. When she was obsessed, she was even more ruthless than the flower addict. When she decided to do something, she did not care what the situation was. Even if Lu Chunjia was a faint flower fragrance or a fragile jade carving, she did not have the spirit to pity her and attack directly. Two slender and steady fingers reached out of her wide sleeves. They were not swords but pins. They suddenly turned and began to write their own lines on the invisible paper on the invisible table in the air. Emo Shanshan's first move was the half-divine talisman. Lu Chunjia sat quietly in the chair. Suddenly, a transparent flower appeared on her fingers. The flower could not be said to be completely transparent. On its surface, there was a faint flow of primordial qi that resembled dew droplets flowing slowly. It looked like it was carved from fog and glaze. It was extremely beautiful. A terrifying pressure enveloped the tent as the half-divine talisman was drawn. A fresh aura seeped out of the tent along with the appearance of the flower. In a tent, the priest of the Revelation Department of the West Hill Divine Palace sensed the two auras coming from afar. He woke up from his meditation and looked in that direction through the curtain. He let out a soft sigh. The half-divine talisman was so full of energy. The calligraphy addict seemed to be stronger than when they met the thief on the meadow. Even he did not dare to say that he could win. Chunjia, this flower was probably going to lose. Lu Chunjia looked at the flower that finally melted into the air and disappeared. She looked at the girl in white and said calmly, "My cultivation state is not as good as yours, and I am not as good as the Tao addict. But I really don't care. If I lose, I lose. What I like is cutting flowers and leaves." Emo Shanshan slowly retracted her right hand into her wide sleeves. She looked at her and said, "If you are only obsessed with flowers, then you are naturally not the flower addict." Lu Chunjia seemed to have thought of something. A gentle smile appeared on her face. There was also a hint of disappointment. She said, the flower addict. I think it should be enough to be obsessed with people and flowers. Emo Shanshan stood up and looked at her. She said, back then you used to hold a hoe and dig in the mud. Your hands were covered in dust and your face was covered in sweat. I think you were better then than the so-called quiet you now. Lu Chenjia lowered her head and continued cutting flowers. She said, but he likes the current me more, and he will protect me. Emo Shanshan looked at her silently. Her lips curled into a smile. It was the first time in her life that she had learned to smile like a winner, so she looked a little awkward. Someone told me last night that it doesn't matter how quiet you appear after you lose. But if you mention Long Qing, it means that you are starting to get angry. Then you will really lose. Lu Chenjia smiled and did not reply. The small scissors in her hands had cut off a green leaf. This chapter is better written than the previous one. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 231. The green leaves drifted down from the branches and slowly landed on the expensive wool carpet without making any sound. Lu Chenjia looked at the beautiful patterns on the wool carpet quietly. She looked at the lonely green leaf in the middle of the pattern. No one knew what she was thinking. After a long silence, she said softly, my feelings for him are as natural as the orchids in the valley. Why did I mention it? Do I want to prove something? Emo Shanshan answered directly. He said that this is a public display of affection and a sign of lack of confidence. I don't know what it means to show off. I don't know why he said that, and I don't know what you want to prove either. But I know that orchids growing in the valley is natural. When you moved the flower in front of me and carefully cut it, it was no longer natural. She did not say anything else. She did not bid farewell and turned to walk out of the screen. Lu Chenjia stood up. Her eyes that were as clear as autumn water showed a faint dimness. She looked at her back and said, the hot tea you wanted has not been served. Why are you in such a hurry to leave? That is the intoxicating grass that I specially brought from Peach Mountain. I remember that you liked it the most back then. Emo Shanshan stopped in her tracks. She did not turn back and replied calmly, compared to a cup of tea, I actually hope to see you in the camp under the meadow. Then you could treat me to a cup of plain water. Lu Chenjia's hand that was holding the small scissors turned pale. She said softly, at the beginning, I did not know that you were in the camp. I also did not think that the horse gang could threaten you. If you were really in danger, do you think that I would still sit quietly in the carriage and ignore you? Emo Shanshan reached out and held the side of the screen. She said, I have said that this is not about you and me. It is about the world. You can ignore the external feelings of joy and sorrow, but I cannot and do not want to be that kind of person. The screen slid open, and the girl in white with an indifferent expression slowly walked out. The disciples of Black Ink Garden who were drinking tea outside and had nothing to do all stood up to welcome her. The students of Revelation Institute on the opposite side also stood up. Emo Shanshan looked at Zhuo Jihua and nodded gently. Her peers then knew that the hill master was not polite to the flower addict during the conversation inside the room. Suddenly their chests were filled with joy. Ignoring the enthusiasm of the Revelation Institute students to ask them to stay, and not even bothering to say a word, the disciples of Black Ink Garden proudly walked out of the magnificent tent with their heads held high. Outside the tent, the blue sky was high and far. There was not a single cloud. The girl in white squinted her eyes and looked at the sky. She thought about how Lu Chenjia had finally lowered her head and lost her arrogance. She could not help but feel relieved. Only then did she understand that this was bullying. Only then did she understand that the so-called revenge was not limited to words or fists. Thinking of this, she looked back at Ning Ke, who was standing quietly in the group of girls. She thought to herself, as a disciple of the Academy of the Tang Empire, he should be generous, but why is he so meticulous? The girls of the Great River Kingdom returned to their own campsite and could no longer suppress their curiosity. They began to ask the hill master what she had said to the flower addict. The tent was filled with chatter and bustle. Even Ning Ke looked towards her. After a moment of silence, Emo Shanshan repeated the previous conversation. The joys and sorrows of the world have nothing to do with her? Does senior brother's death under the meadow have nothing to do with her? It seems that we, the people of the world, are not even comparable to a flower in the eyes of the princess. Cat Girl held the box and said loudly, unable to suppress her anger, if this square box was a gift from Black Ink Garden to the Revelation Institute, why did she bring it back? The flower addict princess seems to be quiet and gentle, but her heart is not in the world. This matter has nothing to do with her. The ones who deserve to die are the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, and the old woman who is standing on the meadow and watching coldly. Zhuozhihua shook her head and looked at the box in Catgirl's arms. She frowned and asked curiously, what is this? This is a secret weapon. Yesterday, Senior Brother Zhong and I spent 100 taels of silver to buy it from someone. Catgirl hugged the box tightly and snorted. She said indignantly, it's a pity that Senior Sister Shanshan refused to use it. Mo Shanshan gently smoothed the paper on the table with her right hand. A few strands of hair fell from her ears. She said, even though Chenjia didn't say it, I have already taught her a lesson. There's no need to humiliate her further. Ning Ke could not help but shake his head when he heard this. In the traveling carriage, he had taught the calligraphy addict on the first day. There was an eternal truth that one had to be beaten to death. Asking for justice and bullying was not much different from beating someone up. Since they were going to fall out with each other, of course they had to humiliate the other party to death. He looked at the calligraphy addict, who was about to start practicing calligraphy again. He suddenly realized that ever since he entered the back of the mountain of the academy, he had been obsessed with cultivation and had forgotten about writing for a long time. Suddenly he realized something else. Ever since he had combed her hair once in the carriage at the tragic camp, she had maintained this hairstyle. Her black hair was simply tied behind her back, revealing her fair and beautiful face, making her look even more graceful and elegant. Zhuozhihua said to the crowd, the Divine Hall will convene a meeting in the afternoon to discuss the matter of assisting the palace and sending troops against the desolate man next year. Disciples of all sects must attend. Everyone eat early and don't waste time. The grassland people lived on mutton, and there was no rice in their meals. Even though the palace had shown enough sincerity to the people from the Central Plains, the most expensive and scarce rice would, of course, be given to the Divine Hall and the Tang army first. Therefore, the disciples of the Black Ink Garden still had oily mutton and mutton soup for lunch today. No matter how much they cooked, mutton was still mutton. After leaving the Blue Loin Sea, these girls had almost never eaten anything else. Yesterday, they had eaten too many new things at the Gumumu meeting. At this time, looking at the plate full of mutton, they found it difficult to get sick of it. Only Ning Ke was still eating carefully. It was said that poor children matured early. So a child who had encountered a rare famine and was tortured to the point of death when he was young would never waste food when he grew up. While chewing slowly, his brain was also working quickly, thinking about other things. The horse gang from the grassland came to kill him, which meant that his identity must have been exposed. But he did not know to what extent and how many people in the palace knew of his existence. The Tang camp in the east was full of the elite cavalry of the northeast border military. What was the relationship between General Shu from Chang'an and Xiaohou? According to the analysis of His Majesty's secret edict before he left, once he revealed his identity, General Shu's buttocks should be sitting next to his buttocks. Until now, he still did not think that the big black horse was a big possibility of his identity being exposed. It had to be said that the great His Majesty and the handsome old Chow from the Spring Breeze Pavilion had met countless people in their lives, but they had made a big mistake in using Ning Quebec. If he was a general, he would definitely be able to defeat everyone, but if he was to be a gold medal secret agent, he would be quite a failure. Oh! After lunch, Ning Ke wiped his oily mouth and took the slightly heavy square box from Catgirl and held it in his arms. Under the warm winter sun, he walked to the bustling area near the palace. The Gumumu gathered a large number of people. Where there were people, there would naturally be business. The lively grassland was where the merchants gathered. Other than the neighboring tribes selling their goods, there were also a few brave caravans from the Central Plains. Somehow, they managed to follow the Divine Temple's negotiation team to this place. The things in the box in his arms were goods that a merchant from the Yen Kingdom had specially brought to win the favor of the Chanyu princess. Last night, he had paid a high price of 100 taels of silver, and even used the name of the flower addict Lu Chenjia to barely buy it. since Mo Shanshan did not want to use it, and he could not bring it back to Chang'an, he naturally did not want it to freeze to death in the cold wilderness. So he decided to ask the Yen Kingdom merchant for a refund, even if it was only 80 taels of silver. Even though he was now an invisible tycoon in Chang, and 100 taels of silver was a huge amount. Not to mention that he would not be able to report it to Sangsang when he returned, even if it was only 80 taels of silver. However, before he reached the place, he was stopped by someone. Hearing the gradually gathering footsteps around him, Ning Ke could not help but raise his eyebrows as he looked at the cold and arrogant Revelation Institute student in front of him. He thought to himself that these people were after all believers of Haotian, and they would not be like the gangsters in Chang and West City who would pull out their swords after blocking the street. So he did not move. More than a dozen Revelation Institute students surrounded Ning Ke in the middle. They seemed to be standing loosely, but in fact they had blocked all possible escape routes. However, as Ning Ke expected, these people did not rush up to beat him up. The arrogant Revelation Institute student in front of him even bowed politely. The student of the Revelation Institute said, "Senior brother of the Black Ink Garden, could you please meet someone?" Ning Ke completely believed that if he said it was not convenient, then what was going to happen next would be very inconvenient for the children to see. He was not afraid of anything, but he guessed that the person who could mobilize so many Revelation Institute students to invite him to meet must be that girl. So he smiled and obediently followed them. On a green meadow outside the tent, the princess of Yueluan Kingdom, Lu Chunjia, sat on a snow-white horse. She raised her hand and signaled for everyone to leave. There were only 2 people and a horse left on the meadow. She looked down at Ning Ke quietly with a strange expression. After a long time she said softly, "I have known Shanshan for many years. Although we have not seen each other for a while, we still write to each other. What is strange is that the calligraphy addict who spoke to me in the tent today seems to have changed into another person." Ning Ke did not expect the girl on the horse to start asking questions so directly. He could not help but feel that it was a little sudden. He did not even have the time to look closely at what this legendary beauty looked like. Lu Chunjia did not wait for him to reply and said with a serious gaze, "She said that she learned a lot from someone. I am very curious about who that someone is, so I took the liberty to invite you over to ask." Ning Ke was slightly stunned and replied sincerely, "I do not know what your highness is talking about." Lu Chunjia looked up into the distance and did not even look at him. She said, "I also do not know when the Black Ink Garden of the Great River Kingdom had a male disciple like you. Who are you?" Ning Ke clenched his fists and swore bitterly in his heart that if His Majesty wanted him to be a spy after returning to Chang, and he would not be stupid enough to agree again. He would not hesitate even if it meant that he would die a little later. If it were not for Miss Elon's kindness tonight, I would not have been able to write a single word. I will send you 3,000 yuan for each chapter and make some adjustments. I will send you 5,000 yuan tomorrow. In addition, I will seriously and attentively recommend the new book of the fattest fatty in the Northeast. My classmate Irjen has finally released a new book. After defying the Celestial, he intends to ask for the devil. Everyone please trample on him. There is no need to give him face. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 232. Looking at the beautiful girl on the white horse, her hair blown by the winter wind, Ning Ke's heart ached. He knew that the situation he was facing now was a little tricky. He did not have many choices left. He could either defeat her from the horse or reveal his identity as a student of the academy. But should he call himself Zhong Dajuan or something else? The problem was that this girl was one of the 3 addicts in the world. Even though her cultivation state was not as high as the Tao addict and Mo Shanshan, her cultivation state was at the upper see-through state, which was enough to bully him. As for revealing his identity as a student of the academy, Ning Ke was still a little hesitant. Lu Chunjia looked down at him calmly. From her expression, it could be seen that she did not care about his answer at all. She continued, harsh, bitter, and dark. The calligraphy addict I met today disappointed me. Because she was originally like me, a rare pure person in this world. She was one of the few friends I had in this chaotic and disappointing world. So I am very curious as to who caused such a huge change in her. I know that there are many dark and ugly things in the world that people like you regard as wisdom. I do not understand and do not want to get involved. I also do not want her to get involved. I hope that you will stay away from her in the future. Ninkei raised his head to look at the beautiful princess on horseback and replied gently, Your Highness, I don't think I need your advice on the relationship between me and the Hill Master. And I don't think such advice will be effective. Shanshan is pure in nature, and has not experienced the affairs of the world. When she first comes into contact with your dark tricks, she will probably find it interesting and think that it is the truth. But you must remember that you men are ultimately the dust and dirt of the world. No matter how you try to cover it up with words and actions, you will one day reveal the filth within. Lu Chenjia looked at him coldly and did not hide her disgust. She said, I just don't want her to be deceived by you. I don't want her to experience disappointment. That is why I came to see you to say these words. Hearing this, Ninkei was certain of a few things. The legendary Anthemaniac princess was not a naive girl who only knew about flowers and plants and hid in her garden. On the contrary, she was very intelligent and sensitive. She could quickly find out the possible reason for Mo Shanshan's change. Moreover, she was a bit of a neat freak both physically and mentally. Thinking of the battle with the horse gang, the cavalrymen of Divine Hall on the meadow, the horse carriage in the middle of the cavalrymen, and the beautiful girl in front of him was also in the carriage at that time, Ninkei became more and more confused. Where did her obsession with spiritual cleanliness come from? How did it manifest in her daily life? Men are filthy things like mud, and women are pure spring water? Ninkei looked at Lu Chenjia, who was on horseback. He smiled and said, Is that what your highness is trying to say? Lu Chenjia's expression changed slightly. She did not expect this dark and dirty man to be able to summarize her thoughts so accurately and concisely. While she was surprised, the pride hidden under her calm and gentle appearance prevented her from mocking Ninkei again. Instead, she nodded. Ninkei suddenly smiled and asked, What about Prince Longqing? During his discussion with Mo Shanshan last night, he had mentioned that the flower addict, Lu Chenjia, who had grown up around the White Tower and lived in the imperial palace since she was a child, was as pure as a piece of paper in terms of cultivation and love. They could only start from these two aspects if they wanted to grab hold of the gap between her and Prince Longqing. Everyone knew about her relationship with Prince Longqing, so her so-called feelings would naturally fall on that perfect man. Lu Chenjia sensed that the young man with the hateful smile on his face had brought up Prince Longqing. She smiled mockingly and said calmly, An idiot like you would naturally not understand that a perfect and flawless man lives in the pure and bright world that you will never be able to touch. Hearing these words, especially the words perfect and flawless, Ninkei could not help but think of Song Song's evaluation of Prince Longqing in the wine shop in Chang'an. He could not help but shake his head and laugh. Lu Chenjia's face turned cold when she saw him laughing for no reason. That was because his laughter was obviously because of Prince Longqing. To her, this was even more serious than humiliating herself. Ninkei suddenly stopped smiling and looked at the beautiful girl on the horse. He asked seriously, In this world, other than the West Hill Divine Palace after the light and the wordless flowers and plants that you cherish so much, everything else is dirty and untouchable. Then I really want to know, Your Highness, do you really think that everything that happened on the meadow that day was clean? Lu Chenjia looked into his eyes and said calmly, That has nothing to do with me. I only know that if you want to use this to drive a wedge between me and Shanshan and lure her into the path of darkness, then you deserve to die. Ninkei looked back into her eyes and said gently, What are you saying? If your highness really wanted to kill me, you would have done so long ago. Why did you specially call me here to talk in private? Lu Chenjia gently stroked the neck of the white horse and said softly, I just want to remind you today that no matter what you are thinking, even if you can hide it from Shanshan, you can't hide it from me and everyone else in the world. You are just an insignificant person like a worm. There are many people in the world who can make you wish you were dead. Ninkei's expression became gentler and calmer. He said softly, What you are doing now seems to be the dirty methods of the world that you hate. Lu Chenjia looked at him and said, Haotian saw the suffering of the world and turned herself into an old woman to help the people and kill the evil. I don't want to get involved in your dirty ways, but it doesn't mean that I will never use harsh methods. At this moment there was no coldness or disgust in her eyes. There was only calmness and gentleness. However, this calmness and gentleness made one feel even more depressed. That was because the gaze in her clear and moving eyes seemed to be looking at a mudskipper struggling in the mud. There was no pity, just a natural look of disdain. She was the flower addict of the 3 addicts in the world. She was a fairy above the clouds and should not be tainted by dust. On the other hand, Ningke was just an insignificant person who tried to get close to another addict with some petty tricks. It was natural for her to look down on him. It was natural for her to want him to obey her words. There was no unnatural feeling. This was the norm in the world. Ningke had seen many colder gazes since he was young. His skin was as thick as a wall, and he did not care about the girl's expression at all. He smiled and replied, "Being alive is definitely better than being dead. I really can't think of any situation that can make people feel that they are better off dead than alive." Lu Chenjia asked, "Are you really curious?" Ningke smiled and said, "This kind of thing is too dangerous. It's safer not to be curious." Lu Chenjia looked at him quietly and suddenly smiled. She said, "An insignificant person will always be an insignificant person. He only knows how to talk and play petty tricks. He will never dare to show the slightest bit of bravery in the real world." Perhaps the girl wanted to use these words to anger Ningke, so that she would have a reason to punish him. Or perhaps she was just a little disappointed and emotional after seeing Ningke's performance. However, when Ningke heard this, he suddenly became silent. He looked up at the azure sky and at the cloud that was gradually floating above the meadow. He frowned slightly and began to think about some problems. After the journey, he reflected on the 2 years since he left the city of Wei. The winter wind blew from afar in the wilderness, blowing his clothes and Lu Chenjia's hair. He did not speak, and neither did Lu Chenjia. Both of them were silent on the horse and on the horse. When I was in the city of Wei, the highest official was General Ma. That general only had a few hundred people under him. He was really powerful. However, I have seen General Shaoqi of the 7th Link Stockade Village once. I was very excited because I was rewarded for my meritorious service. However, I did not expect that General Shaoqi did not even look me in the eye and left in a hurry after handing out the reward. I reckon that he still does not remember who I am. Ningke retracted his gaze and looked at the girl on the horse. He smiled and said, "From that day on, I understood that no matter how many military achievements I made, I would always be an insignificant person. At that time I did not know what cultivators looked like. I thought that you were all immortals who could fly in the sky. I did not know what kind of divine realm your world was. I thought that you all lived in a fairyland in the sky. As for the divine hall Prince Longqing, the Tao addict, the calligraphy addict, the flower addict, and the 3 addicts of the world, to me an insignificant person, they were existences above the clouds. I did not even dare to hope to get close to them." He pointed at the cloud floating above the meadow. "But now many things seem to have changed. For example, I can sit in the same carriage with the calligraphy addict. For example, Your Highness, you are now on a horse and not on the cloud. You are so close to me." Ningke looked at her and said with a smile, "We are so close that I can touch your face with my hand. I believe that other than the king of Yueluan Kingdom and Prince Longqing, no one else has touched your face before. Don't be angry. I am just using this to explain something. The changes I mentioned just now were too intense and fast. It was so fast that I could only accept it passively. I did not have the time to summarize and analyze it. I did not have the time to discover a fact. That is why there are so many problems." Lu Chenjia looked at him quietly and asked, "What fact?" "The fact is that I am no longer an insignificant person." "Then, I should not do things in the style of an insignificant person." After saying this, Ningke smiled. His dimples filled the winter wind blowing on the wilderness. His eyes reflected the white clouds floating in the sky. He was incomparably fresh and confident. He knew that the girl on the horse had psychological problems. He had prepared some other means, the means of an insignificant person. However, after being pressured by the other party, he suddenly thought of what second brother had told him before he left. He thought about what second brother would do if he was in second brother's shoes. Second brother was his idol, and youngest uncle was second brother's idol. Then what would youngest uncle do if he was in second brother's shoes? Based on second brother's arrogant character, he would probably take off the ancient crown on his head and use it as a club to beat the flower addict on the horse until her face was swollen. He would definitely not have tender feelings for the fairer sex. If it was youngest uncle, he would probably pull out his sword and cut off the head of the arrogant white horse. Then, he would step on the flower addict's face. Ninkei was not like second brother, who had reached the knowing destiny state. He was also not like youngest uncle, who had left Jianghu for a long time but was still a legend. He was just a newcomer and his state was pathetically at no doubt state. However, he was still a student at the back of the mountain of the academy, and a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. He did not have the ability to defeat the three addicts of the world. He could not drag Lu Qinjia off the horse, take off her pants, and spank her bare butt until it turned red. Then he could ask Mo Shanshan to draw a sketch and send it to Prince Longqing. However, since he had already understood that he should leave the world of insignificant people, and decided to reveal his identity, he naturally had his own way. When I bought this gift yesterday, I told the merchant from the Yin Kingdom that it was for you. Only then did he agree to sell it to me. I spent 100 taels of silver on it. It's not cheap. Ninkei picked up the square box that he had been holding in his arms and untied the cloth on it. In the box was a small flower tree that was secured by a straw frame and protected by a paper film. He tore off the paper film and showed Lu Qinjia the breathtakingly beautiful blue petals and green stems. He said, of course, even if I gave this flower to you now, I believe that you would not change your opinion of me. So I'm just letting you take a look. Lu Qinjia was slightly stunned. She looked at the blue flower tree in his hands and recognized that it was an extremely rare 7-petal blue lotus. This lotus was blue in color and extremely beautiful. Unfortunately, even though this flower was resistant to drought and cold, it was often accompanied by extremely strong nemesis. Therefore, there were very few of them in the world. The 7-petal blue lotus is indeed a good flower. It's not expensive to sell it for 100 taels of silver in the wilderness. Even though Lu Qinjia hated Ninkei, she was a flower addict and naturally loved flowers. Her evaluation was extremely objective and honest. Then she frowned slightly and reprimanded, even if the 7-petal blue lotus is resistant to cold, it is still a plant from the south of Yan. How can it withstand the cold wind in the wilderness? Hurry up and put away the paper film. Ninkei was very obedient. The girl on the horse asked him to keep it, so he kept it. However, he did not keep the rare flower tree in his hands, but the hands that were holding the flower pot. The flowering tree slipped from his hands and instantly fell to his feet. When it touched the hard ground of the wilderness, the flower pot cracked and shattered like fragile glass. The paper film of the straw rack was all smashed. The beautiful flowering tree inside suddenly became unrecognizable. Its petals were scattered and its green branches were broken. It seemed that it would never come back to life again. Lu Qinjia's expression changed drastically. She pulled the reins and took a few steps forward, but she could not stop this from happening. The beautiful blue petals were scattered on the ground. They rolled slowly in the wind and were stained with a lot of dust. The straw frame and paper film covered the rustling flower tree. The scene was extremely messy. She looked at the broken flowers on the ground in front of the horse and her beautiful face suddenly paled. Her eyes revealed a look of pity. Then she slowly turned around and looked at Ninkei quietly. She said, "Are you provoking me?" Tragedy was tearing the beauty of life apart and showing it to others. Everyone saw the beauty of life differently. The things that they cherished and loved were also different. Money, beauty, power, knowledge, cultivation, and so on. In Lu Qinjia's heart, the beauty of life was not the happiness of the secular world, but the flowers and plants that had nothing to do with the secular world. The deaths of the people in the camp below the meadow did not make her sad. Even if the cavalrymen of Divine Hall and the students of the Revelation Institute fell in front of her, she would not feel sad. But when the 7-petal blue lotus was smashed into the mud in front of her, she really felt a wave of heartache. She knew that the young man in front of the horse had done it on purpose. So besides feeling heartache, she started to get angry. Hearing the sound of the flower pot breaking, the students of the Revelation Institute who were scattered around the meadow did not know what had happened. They rushed over as fast as they could. When they saw the broken flowers on the ground and the unconcealable pain and anger in Princess Lu Chunjia's eyes, they vaguely guessed what had happened. Everyone knew that Her Highness was crazy about flowers. This young man in the uniform of the Black Ink Garden actually dared to do such a thing in front of Her Highness. That was the greatest harm to Her Highness. It was a shameless provocation. With a series of clangs, the steel swords engraved with the talisman patterns of the Divine Hall were unsheathed. Everyone angrily surrounded Ning Quebec. Lu Chunjia got off the horse and walked towards Ning Quebec. She frowned and asked, "What good does my sadness and anger do to you?" Ning Ke looked at her and explained with a smile, "In the tent this morning, you once told Shanshan that the sadness and happiness of the world have nothing to do with you. So I think that my relationship with Shanshan and how I affect her has nothing to do with you. As for this 7-petal blue lotus, I was the one who bought it. So me smashing it has nothing to do with you. Whether you are sad or angry because of this has nothing to do with me. Since that is the case, it is none of your business if I smash it for fun." Lu Chunjia looked into his eyes and said, "Flowers can't speak. They only bloom quietly. But in your hands they have become a sacrifice in the battle between people. Don't you think that this is unfair to them?" Ning Ke looked into her eyes and said, "Those who died in the meadow, such as the senior brother from the Black Ink Garden, can't speak now either. So this world is unfair to them. Of course, I am not someone who likes to fight for injustice. What I care about is that you threatened me earlier, so I have to make you unhappy. That is very fair." Lu Chunjia suddenly asked, "Who exactly are you?" The shattering of the blue lotus on the meadow in the wilderness seemed like a small matter, but in reality, it was like a hard slap to the girl's face. Moreover, she was not an ordinary girl. She was one of the 3 addicts in the world. She had the Yueluan kingdom and the Divine Hall behind her. She was someone who was favored by both Buddhism and Taoism. Even the prince of the Tang Empire would not provoke her in such a way. So even though she was furious, she was still trying to guess Ning Ke's identity. Was he a daring and foolish person? Or did he have a powerful background that allowed him to be unafraid of the Taoism and Buddhism sects? The first thing that was revealed was not Ning Ke's identity, but another identity that Lu Chunjia and the students of the Revelation Institute wanted to know. The identity of the owner of the big black horse. Ning Ke put his finger between his lips and blew a clear and even shrill whistle. After a while, loud hoofbeats sounded in the field to the north of the camp. The hoofbeats were messy and dense, as if the horses were in high spirits and happy. The big black horse came from afar and rushed to the meadow. Then it walked carefully to Ning Ke's side and gently nudged his shoulder. It looked unusually docile. The unusually handsome snow horse behind Lu Chunjia suddenly saw the big black horse appear in front of it. It remembered the painful experience yesterday, and was not comforted by the big black horse's docile expression. It retreated in fear. The reins broke free from Lu Chunjia's hand. Lu Chunjia looked at Ning Ke and the big black horse beside him, as well as the broken flowers and branches at his feet. Ning Ke's gentle expression finally disappeared. She stared at him coldly and said, "So, it's all because of you." Ning Ke cupped his hands in greeting and said gently, "Yes." The big black horse was the focus of everyone's discussion during the Gumumu gathering. The Chanyu of the palace and many other bigwigs were looking for it. They wanted to make it their own mount. Its sudden appearance had attracted countless people in the tribe. A dense crowd chased after it and came to the meadow at the same time. Lu Chunjia's voice was slightly cold as she said, "Do you think I won't dare to kill you just because there are so many people watching? I've said it before. You filth in the mortal world only know how to use petty tricks. You don't know that strength is everything." "I know I'm weak, but I also know that strength doesn't mean everything." Ning Ke took out an waist token from his chest and held it in the air. He said, "Sometimes background is more important." A student of the Revelation Institute saw the words on the waist token and frowned. He said, "Fish dragon sect, what is this?" Ning Ke was slightly stunned. He looked at the waist token and smiled. "Sorry, I took the wrong one." He changed the waist token and held it in front of Lu Chongjia. The expressions of the students of the Revelation Institute changed slightly. Someone shouted, "So what if you're a student of the academy?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "You should have looked more closely." The students of the Revelation Institute took a closer look and saw clearly what this token represented. Everyone fell into a state of shock and silence. They did not know what to do with the Divine Hall swords in their hands. Lu Chongjia also saw the waist token clearly. Her gaze turned cold. "Is there anyone who wants to kill me now?" Ning Ke looked at the students of the Revelation Institute around him and said sincerely, "If no one wants to kill me, then I'll leave first. The meeting that the Divine Hall has called should have started. I don't have much time to waste." Then he looked at Lu Chongjia and said with a smile, "I have a few words to say to you. First, if the difference between a small character and a big character is not their character, but their background, sect, or family, then I'm not a small character. Second, you don't have the ability to make me wish I was dead. I think even the three great gods of the Divine Hall don't have the ability to make me wish I was dead. So I hope that when we meet again in the future, Your Highness, you don't have to say so much nonsense. Finally, there's no perfect person in the world. Of course I'm not. Your partner Prince Longqing isn't either. At least in front of me. He probably doesn't have the confidence to say such words." With that, Ning Ke mounted the big black horse, lifted the reins and galloped toward the camp. Before he mounted the horse, he stepped on the 7-petal blue lotus that was scattered on the ground. No one knew if it was intentional or not. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 233. Looking at the big black horse galloping away, many herdsmen and palace soldiers chased after it excitedly. The students of the Revelation Institute remained silent on the meadow. Many of them had already guessed Ning Ke's true identity. Thinking of the matter that had been the talk of the cultivation world since spring, they could not help but worry about Princess Chonjia's feelings. Princess Chonjia's fiancé was Prince Longqing. The godlike man's life had been smooth sailing. Neither the elders of the Lang Temple nor the headmaster of the Revelation Institute could break his perfect exterior and exterior. He had only lost once in the academy in the south of Chang, and although not many people knew what had happened that time, a loss was a loss. Today was probably the first time Lu Chongjia had seen the man who had defeated her fiancé. The students of the Revelation Institute were worried that she would be upset. They did not dare to look at her in case she felt embarrassed or angry. They could only lower their heads and pretend to look at the ground of the wilderness. There were 7-petal blue lotuses scattered on the meadow. It was a mess. Lu Chonjia's beautiful face did not show any embarrassment, but her usually calm heart was in a mess. She took out an expensive silk handkerchief from the snow saddle and walked to the broken flower pots. She carefully wrapped the blue lotuses that were about to wither and turn black from the cold wind. Then she carried it in her arms and mounted the horse, walking towards her tent. A disciple of the Revelation Institute behind her mustered up the courage to remind her, "Your Highness, the Divine Hall has called for a meeting today to summarize the matters of the frontier fortress for the past few months. We also need to discuss the plan to deal with the desolate man next year. This is a serious matter. You should go and take a look." Lu Chongjia lifted the reins lightly. She did not care about the voice behind her, nor did she care about the meeting called for by the Divine Hall. She only looked at the big black horse in the distance, thinking about many things. When the news of the opening of the second floor of the academy spread in spring, she had been silently paying attention and praying. She hoped that her partner would get what he wanted and enter the back of the mountain to become the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. However, she did not expect such a proud, confident, and powerful man who seemed to never be defeated to actually be defeated. After that, Prince Longqing returned to West Hill. Although the two had never discussed the matter of the second floor of the academy, she could clearly feel that the current Longqing was slightly different from before. He was still proud and confident, radiating a dazzling brilliance, but there was something unnatural in that pride and confidence, and there was a very faint shadow in the brilliance. Lu Chongjia knew how all of this had happened, It was all because of Ning Quebec. Failure was not terrible. For people like Prince Longqing and her, they had accurately understood the relationship between failure and success when they first learned cultivation at a very young age. However, Longqing's state was profound and his Taoist heart was clear. He was only one step away from entering the knowing destiny state. Ning Ke, on the other hand, had just learned cultivation. His strength was weak and his state was shallow. One could imagine the blow to a cultivator's state of mind if he failed on such a basis. When it came to love, one would be happy because of the other person's happiness and sadness, and forget about the happiness and sadness of the outside world. As for the person who had defeated Longqing and entered the back of the mountain of the academy, she certainly did not like him and even felt enmity towards him. If not for the fact that Longqing had to remove the barrier of his Taoist heart himself, she might have even secretly gone to Chong and humiliated him. Other than enmity and dislike, she could not help but be curious. No one, including her, would think that the headmaster of the academy would be biased when choosing a disciple, and that the academy would use any shameful tricks. Then why did the person called Ning Ke gain more attention than Longqing? What kind of person was that person? She had finally seen that person today, and she also knew what kind of person he was. She believed that she would never forget Ning Ke's despicable look when he threw the flowers and taunted her. Because of this, her memories of the academy became unforgettable. She was ashamed and angry but also emotional. Holding the reins tightly, the flower addict looked at the big black horse that was about to enter the meeting tent of the Divine Hall. She thought silently and doubtfully, would the disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy all be as shameless as this person? The countries in the Central Plains were ordered by the Divine Hall to help the Yan Kingdom against the barbarians. The Tang Kingdom and the Yan Kingdom were located in the north, so they sent a large number of cavalries, while the other countries and sects sent their young cultivators to obey the order. Now that the coalition army and the palace had reached an agreement, the forces of all countries would naturally gather together to discuss what to do in the future. The convener was undoubtedly the Divine Hall. The Left King's palace had spent a lot of manpower and resources to set up a very large meeting tent for the bigwigs of the Divine Hall, showing their sincerity. The tent had a radius of 100 paces and was made of bamboo and wood. The tent was bright and spacious, and even if it could accommodate more than 100 people, it would not seem crowded. The priest of the Revelation Department of the Divine Hall was the most distinguished person present, so he naturally sat in the middle. Xu Cheng, the general of the Tang Empire, sat close to his right, while the seat on his left was empty. The generals of the Yan Kingdom, the disciples of the Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom, the monks of the White Tower Temple of the Yueluan Kingdom, and the disciples of the small vassal countries and sects sat below according to their respective seats. The seats of the students of the Revelation Institute were still empty. Mo Shanshan, the calligraphy addict, and the disciples of the Black Ink Garden of the Great River Kingdom had already sat opposite those empty seats. The seats of the disciples of the Black Ink Garden were close to the camp of the Tang Empire, which was higher than that of the South Jin Kingdom and Yueluan Kingdom. Originally, the Great River Kingdom was weak and should not be treated with such courtesy. However, Mo Shanshan was too famous for the calligraphy addict. Except for a few people in the tent, no one was qualified to sit above her, so the Divine Hall made this arrangement. The discussion had not yet entered the main topic when an old woman with white hair and wrinkled skin, wearing a beggar-like garment, walked in slowly with a cane in her hand, coughing from time to time. The priest of the Revelation Department bowed slightly and said with a smile, "Thank you for your hard work, Aunt." Everyone in the tent, including General Xu Cheng of the Tang Empire, stood up and saluted the old woman. This old woman was the sister of the king of the Yueluan Kingdom. Although she had given up the title of eldest princess because she had become a nun for cultivation, she still had the powerful forces of the Buddhism sect hidden behind her. Neither the Divine Hall nor the Tang Empire would slight her. Mo Shanshan did not stand up. She quietly looked at the hem of her white dress, as if she had found some unpleasant dirt there. She did not stand up, so the disciples of the Black Ink Garden behind her naturally did not stand up to salute her. On the contrary, the young girls knew that this old woman was on the meadow that day, so they could not help but show some hatred in their eyes. Everyone was drunk and I was the only one awake. The one who was awake would be the odd one out. Everyone got up and I sat quietly. The one who sat would be the odd one out. Everyone in the courtyard greeted him and bowed like waves, highlighting the Great River Kingdom girls who were sitting quietly. The greetings in the tent gradually quieted down. The atmosphere suddenly became silent and awkward. Aunt Cuny Mattie glanced at the young girls coldly. Looking at these girls who were still fresh and lovely after being blown by the wind and sand of the wilderness for several months, she felt unhappy. Because of their disrespectful and even hostile eyes, she was even angrier. She sat down beside the priest of the Revelation Department and said in a gloomy tone before anyone spoke, "The tribes of the wilderness of the north are inseparable from the devil's doctrine. No one knows how many evil remnants of the devil's doctrine are hiding among the desolate men. Killing the evil is something that we of the righteous must do, so it is not hard to say. However, to deal with the desolate men, the first thing is to unite within the righteous sects and strengthen our own abilities." The old woman looked at the young disciples in the tent and said coldly, "In the past few months of fighting, you young juniors have performed well, but some people have done things in a mess. As a result, they have created a situation that is difficult to clean up, and almost ruined the Divine Hall's plan. I think regardless of punishment, you must first learn to reflect on yourself." At this time, most of the people in the tent already knew that the disciples of Black Ink Garden had escorted the provisions here and were ambushed by the horse gang. They thought that Aunt Cuny's words should be referring to this matter. They did not know how the calligraphy addict and the disciples of Black Ink Garden would explain it. As expected, Cuny Mattie's deep-set eyes overflowed with disdain and anger. She said coldly, "In order to repair the wilderness, the Divine Hall decided to send provisions to assist the palace. Now that the provisions have been destroyed, although Chanyu did not say anything and there is no problem with the peace talks, someone has to be responsible for this in the name of Haotian." Hearing this virtuous and respected aunt speak out directly, the crowd could not help but fall silent. Only the sound of long and short breaths could be heard faintly. Many people looked at Emo Shanshan, who had been sitting quietly. Hearing this, the priest of the Revelation Department smiled slightly. He knew that the old woman did not like the Black Ink Garden for some reason and wanted to make a fuss. However, before leaving, the great divine priest of Revelation had told him that the calligraphy addict, Emo Shanshan, was too lonely. If he wanted her to become the pillar of the Divine Hall in the future, she still needed to be polished. So he did not say anything. General Shu Chang came from Chang and City and did not care about the internal affairs of the Divine Hall. However, the Empire and the Great River Kingdom had always been on good terms. At this time, seeing Cuny Mattie oppressing the girls of the Great River Kingdom, he was a little displeased. He frowned slightly and asked what happened. The priest of the Revelation Department was a man with white hair and beard, but he still looked very young. After thinking for a while, he said gently, "Chan Bachi, the commander of the Papal Guardians of the Judicial Department, personally experienced this matter. Let him tell you." These words seemed ordinary and casual, but in fact it was extremely clever. The Papal Guardians of the Divine Hall were under the command of the two priests of the Judicial Department, and had nothing to do with the Revelation Department. He let the commander come to explain. No matter what the result of the dispute would be, the Revelation Department could still stay out of it and maintain a detached and fair position. Chan Bachi, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, looked at the crowd with a solemn face and said, "That day, the disciples of the Black Ink Garden were timid and afraid to fight, and let the horse gang break into the camp. The soldiers and civilians of the Yin Kingdom suffered heavy casualties. I saw that things were not right, so I led the troops to take the risk and launch a surprise attack to break the siege of the horse gang." The disciples of the Black Ink Garden looked at each other and felt cold all over. Their clenched fists trembled slightly. They had lived in Mogan Mountain since childhood. How could they know that there was such a shameless person in the world? Cat Girl rushed out with a red face and shouted angrily at the commander of the cavalrymen, "Chan Bachi, you are shameless. Thank you for your recommendation votes. Please continue to let me thank you. Tonight I will start to revise the second volume. That's it. Tomorrow 6,000 words will be guaranteed at least. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 234. Catgirl pointed at the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall and scolded with a red face. The Revelation Department priest's face darkened slightly. Aunt Cuny Mattie's eyes were suddenly filled with anger. She stared at the little girl and said coldly, "You don't have any respect for seniority. How did your master teach you? Is it your turn to speak out?" Zhuo Zhihua took 2 steps forward and pulled Catgirl back behind her. She bowed to those bigwigs and forcibly suppressed the anger in her heart. She said in a trembling voice, "Aunt, this matter is related to the reputation of our black ink garden. Junior brother Sher was buried in the meadow. Can't we talk?" Cuny Mattie's wrinkled face showed a trace of disgust. She said gloomily, "As a disciple of the master of calligrapher, he couldn't even defeat the horse gang. He deserved to die because he was not as good as others." For hundreds of years, the Yueluan Kingdom and the Great River Kingdom had been incompatible because of the dispute in the Tianmu Forest. No one knew how many big and small wars had taken place between the two sides. It could be called a blood feud for generations. The Yueluan Kingdom had a vast territory and was a place where Buddhism flourished. Its strength was far above the Great River Kingdom. Especially in recent years, the relationship between the West Hill Divine Palace and the Yueluan royal family was getting better and better. If the Tang Empire and the Great River Kingdom were not close, the monk army of the Yueluan Kingdom might have already set foot on the territory of the Great River Kingdom. As the sister of the king of Yueluan Kingdom, Cuny Mattie certainly hated the people of the Great River Kingdom. She was involved in the coercion at the Yen camp over the past few months, the snatching of the hot spring, and the difficult task of transporting provisions. Therefore, she was not polite to the disciples of Black Ink Garden and spoke harshly and overbearingly. Since the disciples of the Black Ink Garden left the Mogan Mountain of the Great River Kingdom and came to the frontier fortress of the north of Yen Kingdom, they had been constantly enduring the humiliation and frame-up from the Yueluan Kingdom. Now in the tribe of the Palace of the Wilderness, in the meeting convened by the Divine Hall, they did not feel ashamed at all. They even spoke rudely to the dead fellow disciples. Even if the girls were gentle, they could not control their anger and stood up one after another. With the clear sound of swords swinging, more than a dozen slender swords were aimed at Aunt Cuny Mattie. At this moment they had already forgotten how noble this old lady was. Under the wide tent, the monks from the Yueluan Kingdom's White Tower Temple saw the disciples of the Black Ink Garden dared to draw their swords. They stood up angrily and wanted to rush to Aunt Cuny Mattie to protect her. Cuny Mattie raised her old arm to indicate to the sadhus. Cuny Mattie raised her swords in their hands and looked at the kingdom's girls of the disciples of the and kingdom's eyes. How could the Great River Kingdom girls be allowed to act recklessly in the meeting convened by the Divine Hall? Instead, the aunt cold-bloodedly hoped that the girls would be blinded by hatred. Once they really dared to use their swords against her, both the people of the Divine Hall and the cultivators from other countries would deal with them harshly. More importantly, even the Tang general who had been silent all the time would not be able to intervene. Zhuo her and held and looked Chu and looked back. Many people like her looked at that place. Mo Shanshan, the calligraphy addict, was still sitting quietly in the chair. She didn't seem to hear Cuny Mattie's insult to her sect. She didn't seem to have any opinion on what happened on the meadow and felt nothing. She looked down at her pure white dress and seemed to regard the stain as a lotus flower. Because of her silence, the atmosphere in the tent became more and more tense. No one knew whether the kingdom's girls would draw their swords out of shame and anger, which would lead to uncontrollable consequences. The priest of the Revelation Department of the Divine Hall, who was sitting in the first seat, looked more and more gloomy. A few drops of dew seemed to condense between his white eyebrows. This bigwig had enough reasons to be dissatisfied with Cuny Mattie and the disciples of the Black Ink Garden. For example, they didn't respect him. But thinking of the relationship between the judicial department and the Yueluan Kingdom, he didn't say a word. The invisible string in the air became tighter and tighter. The sarcasm and contempt in the wrinkles on Cuny Mattie's face became more and more obvious. If the situation went on like this, the Great River Kingdom's girls would still be humiliated. But if the Great River Kingdom's girls dared to despise the majesty of the Divine Hall and fight by themselves, no one knew what kind of miserable end they would face. The headmaster of the academy once said that the more you argue, the clearer the truth will be. No matter what the truth of the horse gang's robbery is, you should always listen to the opinions of both sides. You little girls should talk nicely. Why did you pull out the sword from the scabbard? Don't you know that Aunt Cuny Matty is so straightforward? These words contained a hint of mockery of Cuny Matty's behavior and manner of talking. It vaguely showed that she was partial to the disciples of the Black Ink Garden. Everyone in the tent could not help but be in an uproar. However, the person who said this was General Shuchong of the Tang Empire. So neither the priest of the Divine Hall nor Cuny Matty herself could question it. Cuny Matty snorted coldly. She looked back at General Shu and said in a cold voice, "I'd like to see what they can say." Zhuo Jihua was gentle and had the ability of a deacon. She took this opportunity to reprimand her junior sisters to step back. Then she took a few steps forward, bowed with hands folded in front, and carefully told what happened on the meadow that day. The same story told by different people had the same ending, but the process was completely different. In the words of Chanbachi, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, the disciples of the Black Ink Garden of the Great River Kingdom were a group of incompetent and cowardly good-for-nothings, which led to the destruction of the provisions and the heavy casualties of the soldiers and civilians of the Yen Kingdom. In Zhuo Jihua's story, the commanders of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall on the meadow were cold-blooded and selfish. They clearly saw their fellow righteous people in a desperate situation, but they refused to help. Only when the disciples of the Black Ink Garden were about to win the bloody battle did they rush down to snatch the military merits. Zhuo Jihua was careful not to mention Aunt Cuny Matty, flower addict Lu Changjia, and people of the White Tower Temple of the Revelation Institute. However, everyone present knew why the cavalrymen of Divine Hall entered the wilderness. Their faces changed slightly. The cultivators of the South Jin Kingdom and the Tang army subconsciously glanced at Cuny Matty with a somewhat complicated expression. Everyone somewhat believed that the story of the Black Ink Garden disciples was true, because these girls were unreasonable. In order to shirk their responsibilities, they had offended the Divine Hall and the Yueluan Kingdom. Their provisions had been destroyed, so they should not be punished too harshly. However, who knew what kind of trouble there would be if they offended these bigwigs? Belief was the human heart, but there was no such thing as the will of the people in the world. What was important was evidence. Besides evidence, there was also strength. The stronger the strength and background, the more powerful the words of the person. The Great River Kingdom was small and weak. Although there was a master of calligrapher in the Black Ink Garden, he was just a visiting professor of the Divine Hall. How could he compete with the Divine Hall and the Yueluan Kingdom? Cuny Matty coldly stared at Zhuo Jihua, who had finished her story and retreated. After a moment of silence, she suddenly laughed in a very strange and hoarse voice, looking particularly gloomy. "I was also on the meadow that day. According to what you said, the cavalrymen of Divine Hall did not join the battle in time. Isn't it also my responsibility? Aren't you saying that I'm also cold-blooded and selfish?" Zhuo Jihua looked up at her quietly with her eyes full of determination, and said, "I didn't know that you were also on the meadow at that time. As for whether you had anything to do with the cavalrymen of Divine Hall's failure to rescue in time, I naturally don't know. Whether I'm responsible or cold-blooded, it's up to you, Aunt." There was an uproar in the field. No one thought that this female disciple of the Black Ink Garden had the courage to directly point at Cuny Matty. Some people faintly admired her courage. Cuny Matty stared at Zhuo Jihua and shouted angrily, "What a bunch of nonsense! In order to shirk your responsibilities, you dare to confuse right and wrong and frame the Divine Hall and me. Your aunt loved the younger generation, wanted to let you go and punish you a little bit. I didn't expect that you were so evil. Then don't blame me for teaching you a lesson on behalf of your master." Catgirl stared at her and said without showing weakness, "You're so old and you're still lying. You're shameless." Cuny Matty was so angry that she laughed. She sat back in the chair and said nothing, just waiting for the final result. The priest of the Revelation Department was silent. He gently stroked the snow-white hair on the top of his head and sighed faintly in the bottom of his heart. He was a little unhappy with the old woman beside him, but he had no way to deal with her. In the previous dispute between the two sides, The disciples of the Black Ink Garden were very moderate in their accusations. They only targeted the cavalrymen of the judicial department and did not involve Cuny Matty and the people of the White Tower Temple of the Revelation Institute. However, this old woman actually jumped into it on her own initiative. She was using her old face to force the Divine Hall to express its position. If he later decided to favor the Black Ink Garden, it meant that he believed the words of the girls and admitted that the highly respected Aunt Cuny Matty was afraid of death, and even had the malicious intention of killing people with a borrowed knife. The West Hill Divine Palace and the Buddhism sect had a close relationship. The unknown place behind them had been communicating with each other for thousands of years. Although they respected Taoism, they supported each other. In the secular world, the Divine Hall needed the loyalty and offerings of the Ueluan Kingdom's royal family. Not to mention that both sides could only narrate what happened that day without any evidence. Even if the disciples of the Black Ink Garden produced evidence and the priest was willing to punish the cavalrymen of the judicial department for the sake of superficial justice, at this moment, in order to save the old face of Aunt Cuny Matty, he could only choose to believe the words of the commander. The hatred between the Ueluan Kingdom and the Great River Kingdom has accumulated so much? After a moment of silence, the priest of the Revelation Department looked at the crowd and said calmly, "The peace agreement between the Central Plains and the palace has been reached. Although the batch of provisions was destroyed, it is not a big deal. I will punish the disciples of the Black Ink Garden to copy the scriptures of light 3 times. However, in the previous dispute, the disciples of the Black Ink Garden accused the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall of being untruthful and disrespectful to the elders. You should sincerely apologize to Aunt." After finishing his sentence, he looked back at the Tang army sitting on the right side. General Shuchang was silent for a moment. He felt that such a light punishment was a rare kindness from the Divine Hall. After nodding, he looked at the girls of the Great River Kingdom and comforted them gently. The disciples of the Black Ink Garden are not afraid of writing. Aunt Cuny Matty's face was still gloomy. It was obvious that she was very dissatisfied with the priest of the Revelation Department. But she was also clear about the dark dispute between the 3 departments of the Divine Hall. She knew that the matter involved the cavalrymen of the Judicial Department, and the Revelation Department would not be too partial. So she remained silent and looked up indifferently, waiting for the apology. Listening to the priest of the Revelation Department's final decision, the monks of the White Tower Temple did not know what to think. But the disciples of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom all thought that the Tang people and the Great River Kingdom were close. If the disciples of the Black Ink Garden were bullied too much, it would probably lead to more disputes. Now that the people of the Tang camp expressed their satisfaction, they were relieved. No one cared about the feelings of the girls of the Great River Kingdom. They stood alone in the corner of the tent, still holding the Xiao sword in their hands, but their eyes were full of anger and confusion. They knew in advance that it was impossible for the Divine Hall to deal with it fairly, because the apologetic Divine Army was originally the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall. But they did not expect that the Divine Hall would deal with it in such a way. The priest of the Revelation Department's decision was very gentle in everyone's eyes. However, these girls from the south were gentle and firm. What they cared about was not the gentleness, but the reversal of black and white behind it. So they were angry. However, in the face of the bright and majestic Divine Hall, in the face of the whole cultivation world, and in the face of the reality that everyone in the tent breathed a sigh of relief, what could they do? Did they really have to bow their heads and apologize to the old woman? So they were confused. All the disciples of the Black Ink Garden, including Zhuo Jihua, turned their heads and looked at Emo Shanshan, who was sitting quietly in the chair. Emo Shanshan slowly rose to her feet. There was not a single trace of emotion on her elegant and indifferent face. Her thin, red lips were pursed into a straight line, making her look particularly unyielding. It formed a sharp contrast with her soft black hair. Her dress flowed down like water. She stood in the water and looked at the bigwigs above. She shook her head and said calmly, "Priest, I don't accept this result." At this time, many people were watching her and wanted to know what she would say. According to the rumored temperament of the calligraphy addict, people were not very worried. However, They did not expect that the rumored calligraphy addict seemed to be vaguely different from the real calligraphy addict in front of them. Her response was so simple and stern. There was no emotional debate or angry accusation. From the beginning of the meeting, she had been silent until the divine hall came out with the final result. Then she said softly, "I don't accept it." Since she didn't accept it, then it was as if nothing had happened. The expression of the priest of the Revelation department changed slightly. He leaned forward slightly and looked at Emo Shanshan, who was not far away. His white hair and beard slowly released a coercion. He had been waiting for the calligraphy addict to show her attitude, but she had not shown it before. At this time, when all parties came out with the result, she made her statement. He could only think that it was a provocation to the dignity of the divine hall. "Hill Master, I have always respected you. I really want to know what your attitude is." Emo Shanshan looked at the priest calmly and bowed slightly. She said, "My attitude is that I don't accept it. Neither I nor my master will accept the unfair result." "Why mention the master of calligrapher? Even if he is here today, I will say the same." Cuny Matty stared at her white cheeks coldly and asked in a gloomy tone, "Hill Master, you have the guts not to accept the result of the divine hall. Do you think that the divine hall and I, an old woman, have been unfair?" The saying, "age is more ruthless than death," described this aunt. She was an extremely honorable senior cultivator, but today she had forced the room for conversation into nothingness twice. Her gloomy words were like a cold sword stabbing directly into the other's heart. Everyone present knew the elegant and dull temperament of the calligraphy addict. Although her previous performance had surprised everyone, they thought that Aunt Cuny Matty had thrown the divine hall in front of her at this time, so she should remain silent. However, today the calligraphy addict surprised everyone again. Emo Shanshan looked at the old woman expressionlessly and said calmly, "You have always been unfair." Countless sounds of people sucking in cold breaths rang out in the tent. The priest of the Revelation department looked at her quietly and said, "Hill Master, if there is no evidence, you can't accuse the divine hall of being unfair. I don't want to send a letter to Mogan Mountain. Please be careful." Emo Shanshan's sparse eyelashes trembled slightly. Her eyes were unfocused, as if she was looking into the distance. She said, "What I don't understand is why what I and my fellow disciples of the Black Ink Garden say is not evidence. Then why is what they say the evidence?" There was silence in the tent. The calligraphy addict's words directly pointed out the most fundamental problem of today's matter. However, whether words could be used as evidence had nothing to do with the degree of credibility. It was only related to who the speaker was. The effect of the words of a rich man and a beggar in the court was always different. This was the way of the world. What could they do? Cuny Matty suddenly laughed hoarsely and old. When the laughter gradually subsided, she looked at Emo Shanshan not far away and said with pride, contempt and sarcasm, "Who in the world will believe that I, Cuny Matty, will also tell a lie?" It was not who would believe but who dared to believe. After a moment of silence, the priest of the Revelation department looked at the disciples of various countries and asked, "Does anyone know where the horse gang came from? Did any disciples of other sects pass through the meadow that day?" No one answered, because there were indeed no other cultivators passing through the meadow that day. As for the horse gang, there might be some lucky ones who escaped, but how could they find them in the vast wilderness? In the quiet meeting tent, Emo Shanshan bowed her head and looked at the tips of her shoes poking out from under her skirt. She was silent for a long time, thinking about what someone had said to her in the carriage about the tiger and the rabbit, and the tiger and the tiger. "I can accept the punishment from the Divine Hall, but the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall said that the disciples of the Black Ink Garden are muddle-headed and incompetent, cowardly and afraid to fight, and even dare not to fight against the horse gang. I can't accept it. I have been thinking about how to prove my courage and ability." She flicked her fingertips and pulled out a tiny saber from the waist of Zhuozhi Hua. She looked at the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall named Chanbachi expressionlessly and said, "Although you are also a cultivator of the see-through realm, I will not be bored enough to challenge you, because you are not qualified, so you don't have to worry." Emo Shanshan turned her eyes slightly and fell on Cuny Matty's ugly old face, which was like a paddy field after a drought. She calmly said, "I am Emo Shanshan, a disciple of the Black Ink Garden. "Aunt, please enlighten me." As soon as she finished speaking, she put the small saber across her palm, with the blade facing down. She exerted force on her wrist and was ready to cut it open. "Wait!" The priest of the Revelation Department and General Shu of the Tang Kingdom were shocked and stood up to stop her. The Great River Kingdom was deeply influenced by the Tang Kingdom. Even if it was a duel, it was customary to follow the rules of Chong and City. Cutting sleeves was an invitation to a duel, and cutting palms was a duel to the death. The reaction of the people in the tent was a little slower than that of the two bigwigs. After a while, they understood the intention of her action and stood up in shock. There was a sound of chairs and stools collapsing. Emo Shanshan had issued an invitation to a duel to the death to Aunt Cuny Matty. As everyone knew, Emo Shanshan was one of the most famous 3 addicts in the world among the younger generation of cultivators. She was a master at the upper see-through state. However, the so-called 3 addicts were not only related to the state of cultivation, but also to the appearance of the 3 women. But the person she was going to challenge today was Aunt Cuny Matty, a powerhouse of the Buddhism sect who had been famous for a long time. Although she was the calligraphy addict, no one was optimistic that she could defeat a predecessor who had decades of cultivation. Therefore, everyone felt that the calligraphy addict looked particularly beautiful today because of her willpower. She was breathtakingly beautiful. Cuny Matty looked at the junior coldly. She held the armrest of the chair with her skinny old tree-like hand and slowly stood up. The priest of the Revelation Department looked at Emo Shanshan and reprimanded her angrily. "What are you doing? Put away your saber quickly." Emo Shanshan seemed to have not heard what he said at all. She held the hilt of the saber with her right hand slightly. There was chaos outside the tent. It was extremely noisy. When the tent curtain was lifted and Ning Ke walked in with the big black horse, he saw Emo Shanshan holding the knife horizontally in her palm. He was so shocked that he did not care that there were so many people in the tent. He shouted angrily, "What are you doing? Put away your saber quickly." Emo Shanshan looked at him in the distance and slowly put down the knife in her hand. She said softly, "Apart from this, I can't think of any other way to wash away the injustice of my dead comrade. Because he is already dead and will not speak again. And it seems that no one will listen to what I say." There was no expression on her face. She was so calm that it seemed that she was talking about a trivial family matter. However, in Ning Ke's eyes, the girl standing there alone was obviously so fragile and sad. Only he could see her fragile and sad. Everyone in the tent followed Emo Shanshan's gaze to the tent curtain. They looked at Ning Ke with curiosity and surprise. The Revelation priest could not stop the calligraphy addict, but this person said exactly the same words as the priest, and the calligraphy addict obediently put away her saber. Then, people in the tent noticed the trust in the calligraphy addict's calm eyes. They noticed the dependence hidden in the eyes of the Great River Kingdom girls that suddenly brightened. Only then did they realize that they seemed to be used to placing their hopes on this young man. They could not help but feel more confused. When people saw the big black horse in his hand, they were even more shocked and speechless when they thought of the scene on the horse race road yesterday. They all thought to themselves, "Who on earth is this young man?" Last night, I did not finish the revision of this volume. I will continue today and tomorrow. Also, I have to say in advance that the first chapter of this volume has been revised. But the words at the end of the chapter are more important, including the advertisement of Futian. So I will not touch them for the time being. When this volume is finished, I will replace them together. Also, there is no rest this Saturday. Don't forget, last notice, the first place in the weekly list is very dangerous. Don't forget to vote for the recommendation. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 235. Catgirl rushed over and repeated what had happened in the tent in detail. Especially when she mentioned Cuny Matty's words. The little girl was even more furious. Everyone in the tent silently watched the conversation between Ning Ke and Catgirl. Because they did not know the specific identity of the young man, They remained silent for the time being. They were very curious about what would happen next. Now that the priest of the Revelation Department had come to a conclusion, and Aunt Cuny Mattie's expression was gloomy, would there be any change? Many people of the palace tribe followed the big black horse to the tent. It was noisy until the steward of the Divine Hall, who was responsible for maintaining order, went out to reprimand them. Then it gradually quieted down. Ning-Ke knew what had happened from Catgirl's narration. After a moment of silence, he put the reins of the big black horse on the tobacco pipe at the entrance of the tent, but did not tie it tightly. He looked at Mo Shanshan in the distance and said, "So that's what happened. Is it worth for you to cut your palm? There must be other ways to prove it." Everyone in the tent was still silent. They looked at him with some curiosity and some mockery. They thought that although there was no evidence, the matter of meeting the horse gang on the meadow was not about evidence. How could he prove it? These thoughts and feelings were hidden in the hearts of the people, but Catgirl asked directly. Thinking of the anger and helplessness of her senior sisters, she looked at Ning-Ke with her big bright eyes and asked confusedly, "How can you prove it?" Ning-Ke replied seriously, "I can prove it because I was there." He glanced at the disciples of various sects of the Central Plains in the tent with different expressions, raised his right hand to point at the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall in the distance, and said, "I can prove that the cavalrymen of Divine Hall on the meadow did not help us and just looked on coldly. After we beat back the horse gang, the commander led the cavalrymen to rush down the meadow, cut off the heads of the horse gang, and snatch the military merits. And I think he even had the idea of killing us at that time." Hearing this, there was an uproar in the tent. The young man not only pointed out that the cavalryman of Divine Hall was despicable and cold-blooded, but also made a more serious accusation of killing us. The uproar, like the wind blowing through the pine forest, gradually subsided. People looked at Ning-Ke with more complicated and weird eyes, thinking that the Divine Hall should believe his words. No one believed that he could turn the situation around. They all felt that he was courting death by accusing the Divine Hall. The face of the priest of the Revelation Department darkened slightly. His silver-like hair was as taut as iron, and he looked unhappy. He didn't expect that the calligraphy addict would be so tough when this farce was about to come to an end. Moreover, this young man who came out of nowhere was trying to make things more troublesome for him. Just as he was about to reprimand him, he noticed from the corner of his eyes that the expression of the great Tang General Shu on his right was somewhat strange. This strange expression came from the smile on the general's face, a smile with a deeper meaning. The priest of the Revelation Department was slightly shocked, wondering if the general of the Tang Empire knew this person. The West Hill Divine Palace illuminated the world and enjoyed a high status. However, they still maintained vigilance and uneasiness towards the Tang Empire's imperial cavalry, which was also respect. Seeing General Shu reveal such an expression, the priest frowned and did not speak. Chan Bachi, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, was accused of being cold-blooded and selfish, not helping the allies, and even trying to kill people to keep their mouths shut after robbing the military merits. His face was already as gloomy as the wet clouds in Min Mountain. He stared at Ning-Ke fiercely at the tent curtain. Although he didn't think that this person was the dark shadow behind the wall of fire under the meadow, he noticed his clothes and angrily rebuked, "Judging from your clothes, you should be a disciple of the Black Ink Garden. In that case, how are you qualified to accuse me of this matter?" Ning-Ke shook his head and said, "I am not a disciple of the Black Ink Garden." After saying this, he took Catgirl's hand and walked into the tent. His leather boots stepped on the thick carpet, making no sound, and his footsteps seemed so stable. The disciples of various sects who were looking at him on both sides of the road looked more and more dignified. They thought that this person admitted that he was not a disciple of the Black Ink Garden, so where did his calmness come from? The commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall's eyes lit up and glanced at Aunt Cuny Mattie. Since Ning-Ke appeared in the tent, Cuny Mattie had been indifferent and silent. She didn't even look at him because she didn't care about these small fries. Until she felt the gaze of the commander of the cavalrymen, she slowly raised her head and looked at Ning-Ke, who was walking towards her. She said in a cold voice, "Since you are not a disciple of the Black Ink Garden, why did you appear in the camp of the grain team that day?" Why did you wear the clothes of the Black Ink Garden? I don't know what kind of heterodox doctrine you are. How dare you pretend to be a righteous person? Take him down and ask him carefully. This was the real confidence brought by the status and strength. Aunt Cuny, a powerful person who could summon wind and rain, wouldn't spend any time debating and negotiating with the opponent. She directly hit him with a stick. Even if she didn't beat him to death, she would knock him out. Even if she wanted to wrongly accuse him, she would do it openly. What else could she say? Hearing the words of Aunt Cuny, the disciples of other sects in the tent were still a little hesitant. However, the sadhus from the White Tower Temple of the Ueluan Kingdom had already stood up with their staffs and were ready to subdue and take down this young man. Emo Shanshan slightly frowned. Before she gave the order, the girls of the Great River Kingdom behind her exclaimed and were about to stop the monks of the White Tower Temple with their swords in their hands. The situation was in chaos. At this moment, a monk of the White Tower Temple saw Ninkei's face clearly. He was suddenly shocked and reached out to stop his senior brother beside him. He hurried to Cuny and said a few words in a low voice. This monk was the one who was ordered by his master to ask for the ownership of the hot spring. He hurt Zhuozhihua and beat Catgirl, but was finally seriously injured by Ninkei's sword and arrow. He had a deep impression of the encounter that day. Ninkei didn't wear a mask that day. How could he not recognize him when they met again today? Cuny heard that this young man turned out to be a student of the academy. Her deep-set eyes suddenly shone and the wrinkles on her face seemed to be blown away by the wind. She stared at Ninkei and said in a hoarse and fierce voice, "It turns out that you are a student of the academy. How dare you be so arrogant and presumptuous? Do you think that I don't dare to teach you a lesson?" Ninkei had already walked to the front and let Catgirl go back to the disciples of the Black Ink Garden. He looked at the old woman and frowned. He shook his head and said, "I just want to prove something for the people of the Black Ink Garden. Why do you teach me a lesson? Do you think you are my teacher? Or are you afraid that I will tell the truth? What are you afraid of?" The 4 questions in a row were not aggressive, but calm and gentle. But thinking that the 4 questions were aimed at Aunt Cuny, who was eccentric and gloomy and had an extremely high status, the people present could naturally feel the hidden toughness in it. They could not help but be shocked and thought that even if he was a student of the academy who came to the wilderness for practice, his behavior was too presumptuous. Cuny was expressionless and looked at Ninkei coldly, as if she was looking at a dead man. Although it seemed that she was not angry because of his words, those who really knew this aunt knew that she was extremely furious at this time. "I don't know which instructor in the academy your teacher is, but I think it's not impossible for me to teach you a lesson given my seniority and status. As for the truth, I really want to know what evidence you can bring out." Cuny's voice was hoarse and unpleasant, but with a harsh contempt and mockery. Ninkei smiled and said, "My words are the evidence." The commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall was furious and snapped, "What a joke! Since when can a person's words be used as evidence?" Ninkei was not angry and replied softly, "I heard that what this old lady said was used as evidence by everyone. Then why can't my words be used as evidence?" There was an uproar again and again. This time it was not because of the toughness shown by the academy student, but because of the title Old Lady. He clearly knew the identity of Aunt Cuny, but he used this kind of domestic language to address her. What he showed was not only toughness, but also undisguised contempt. Old Lady. Cuny had never been addressed like this in her life. Whether it was the king of Ueluan Kingdom or the 3 great divine priests of the Divine Hall, they were all polite to her. She did not expect that she would be humiliated by a junior like this today. She was so angry that she trembled all over. Her old hands tightly grasped the back of the chair, and it seemed that she would stand up and fight at any time. If she had not known that Ninkei was a student of the academy, maybe Ninkei would have been dead at this time. But even if Ninkei was a student of the academy, she did not intend to show any respect to the Tang Empire and must teach this guy a lesson. The commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall could not bear it anymore and flew into a rage. He slammed the table beside him and angrily rebuked, "Aunt is the sister of the king of Ueluan Kingdom. Vedanta of the Buddhism sect. Who do you think you are? How dare you be compared with Ant? Ninkei walked to the girls of the Great River Kingdom and smiled slightly, indicating that the worried girls should not panic. Then he nodded to Imo Shanshan to tell her to leave everything to him. Suddenly, the smile on his face disappeared and he slammed the table beside him into two halves. He lectured, "Who do you think you are? How dare you speak to me in this tone?" At this time, people in the tent already knew that this young man was a bold guy. Even Aunt Cuny Matty was called an old lady by him. Naturally, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall was nothing in his eyes. Although people were still shocked, they did not make an uproar anymore. They silently and coldly watched the development of the situation. It was silent. At this time, if a cat walked on the thick carpet, it would attract everyone's attention. Ninkei tidied up the front of his clothes and was ready to take out the LMID token on his waist. But he was a little hesitant. What kind of action should he take out and what kind of expression should he show? Pride or disdain? It was always very difficult to take out a card beautifully and freely, whether it was the card in the hand or the ID token. The government runner took out the ID token and pointed it at the robber and said calmly, "I'm a messenger." The robber panicked and gave up. The god of gamblers took out the card at the bottom and said with a smile, "No more, no less. I'm just a little bigger than you." The opponent sitting across the long table turned pale and fell to the ground the next moment, clutching his chest. As long as one took out the card in a natural and unrestrained manner, no matter the action, expression or tone, they must be very well coordinated. In this way it would not seem that you were bullying others. Instead, you would be calm and arrogant to the extreme, but you would not smell any anger. Among all the people Ninkei knew in his life, there were countless people who were as arrogant as him. But only second brother was so arrogant that he admired him so much and was so arrogant that he was hopelessly handsome. In his mind, if second brother took out the ID token at this time, he would definitely shock a lot of powerhouses and charm a lot of girls. No, second senior brother didn't need to take out his waist tag. The wooden club on second senior brother's head was an excellent waist tag. With second brother's warning in front of him, Ninkei paid great attention to his demeanor when representing the back mountain of the academy for the first time. He had already regretted taking out the ID token casually on the meadow, and now he was even more uncertain. Holding it in the air like a torch? It was a clear display, but it would be a little stupid. Drawing it out like drawing a knife? It was indeed handsome. But what if people did not see clearly what was written on the ID token and misunderstood that he was going to fight? Although he had gotten rid of the mentality of a nobody and was not afraid of the Ant of the Divine Hall, if they really had a fight, that old woman could kill him with one finger. At this time the atmosphere was tense and depressing, as Silent Hill. Everyone looked at Ninkei and noticed that his expression was a little weird, as if he was thinking about some very complicated problems. But they did not know that the problems he was thinking about had nothing to do with anything in the field, and were purely about other people's business. General Xu Chang had been staring at Ninkei since he entered the tent. This general from the military ministry of Chang, and had already guessed Ninkei's identity. At this time, looking at Ninkei's expression, he thought that it was indeed a little inappropriate to ask Ninkei to introduce himself in such a place like the back mountain of the academy. So he coughed slightly and said with a smile, "Mr. 13, since you are not a disciple of the Black Ink Garden, should you sit beside me?" General Xu Jun's voice attracted everyone's attention. Ninkei was slightly stunned. He did not expect that this general had already known his identity, but then he felt a lot more relaxed. He nodded to Imo Shanshan beside him and walked over as he was told. "Let me introduce him to you." General Xu Chang stood up and gently held Ninkei's shoulder. He first nodded to the priest of the Revelation Department and then looked at the people in the tent. He said with a calm smile, "This is the most famous calligrapher of the Tang Empire in the Tianqi year. He is deeply loved by His Majesty. At the same time, he is also the successor of the West Hill Great Divine Priest Yen Sei. But what I want you to know is that he is Ninkei, who defeated Prince Longqing in the competition on the second floor of the academy this year." Ninkei folded his hands and bowed to the people with a gentle expression. It was quiet in the tent. All the emotions had not had time to ferment and erupt, but everyone looked at Ning-Ke with endless shock and admiration. The priest of the Revelation Department smiled without saying anything and looked at Ning-Ke with great interest. He had already guessed something before, and now his guess was confirmed. He was still shocked, but he did not show it on the surface. In this silence, Ning-Ke looked at Aunt Cunie-Mattie, who looked more and more gloomy, and said, "I heard that you once said, 'Who in the world would believe that you would lie?'" After a pause, he turned to the people in the tent and asked with a smile, "Then I really want to know, who in the world would believe that a student of the second floor of the academy and a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy would lie?" No one dared to answer, whether in the field, in the tent, or in the world. I suddenly realized that this seems to be the first time since Fanxian that I have written with strong colors. Seems that I like it. Sulu had never written with his father, only with his fists. After Ning-Ke succeeded in writing with his father these 2 days, he also began to write with his fists. Why am I so ambitious? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the revised version, revised in 201202250329, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 236. I have revised the last chapter and it should be more detailed. This chapter is on Saturday. Because I have to go out during the day, I stayed up all night to write it. I will send it on time. I wish everyone a good weekend. Just like the silence after Cunie-Mattie asked this question, it was not that no one did not believe what Ning-Ke said, but that no one dared to not believe what Ning-Ke said. The reason was also simple. It was not because Ning-Ke had a noble and holy reputation, but because he was ranked 13th in the back of the mountain of the academy, and had a teacher called the headmaster. For people in the world, the West Hill Divine Palace was naturally the most sacred and solemn place, and the academy in the southern suburbs of Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Empire, was the most noble place. The Tang Empire's cavalry looked down on the world, and the domestic politics and people were harmonious. A large part of the reason was that most of the imperial court and commandery officials were educated in the academy. An ordinary academy was already a giant, let alone the legendary second floor of the academy. The core disciples of the headmaster lived on the second floor. They rarely walked in the world and gradually became legendary figures. But when they appeared, they could be as weak as nobles and ministers. They could even stand up to the leaders of various sects and even the bigwigs of the Divine Hall. Who would have the courage to jump out and question such figures? Mo Shanshan once said to her fellow disciples at the hot spring by the blue sea that a false reputation was the most powerless thing. Strength always came from strength itself, just like ink and brush always came from ink and brush. So today in the tent, when arguing about the horse gang in the meadow, people's real feelings were biased towards the disciples of the Black Ink Garden. She was also famous, but standing opposite her was the Divine Hall and the Yueluan Kingdom, so no one believed or dared to believe it. At this time, the person who said the same words was Ning Quebec. Behind him stood the two unattainable peaks, the headmaster of the academy and the Tang Empire. So at this time, the most powerful person in the tent was him. Exclamations finally broke out. The people in the tent looked at Ning-Ke and were so shocked that they didn't know what to say. They could only forcibly suppress their exclamations and exclamations. Then all the sounds disappeared again. The tent returned to its previous state of silence, except for the sound of rapid breathing. For the cultivators of various sects, Ning-Ke was definitely not an unfamiliar name, although he seemed to have directly entered the beautiful cultivation world of primordial qi in an unexpected manner this spring. Under the instruction of the great divine priest of the judicial department, the Divine Hall had been promoting his name. Therefore, all the followers of Haotian in the world soon knew that there was a man named Ning-Ke who had helped another legendary powerhouse kill a monk of the Yueluan Kingdom, and a sword master of the South Jin Kingdom in one night at the Spring Breeze Pavilion in Chang'an City. Everyone in the world knew that this person named Ning-Ke had defeated the dazzling and perfect Prince Long Qing in the competition on the second floor of the academy. What was even more shocking was that everyone knew that the name Ning-Ke had appeared in the Re-Hand Scroll of the Tomes of Arcane. Although no one had read the tomes of Arcane and many people had doubts about it, since the news was spread with the approval of the West Hill Divine Palace, it should not be false. He had just entered the second floor of the academy, become the successor of the Divine Talisman Master, and was qualified to write his name in the tomes of Arcane. How could the young cultivators of various sects in the tent not be shocked, in awe and in envy with such a shocking experience? Perhaps it was because of the old incident at the Spring Breeze Pavilion and the dead people in the old incident, but the eyes of the disciples of the Sword Garret of the South Gene Kingdom, and the monks of the White Tower Temple of the Ueluan Kingdom were filled with awe and envy, as well as some hostility. The most shocked people were actually the disciples of the Black Ink Garden. Catgirl blushed slightly and stared at Ning Ke blankly. Her bright eyes were full of joy and disbelief. The girls covered their mouths tightly to prevent themselves from screaming out of shock. They had thought that Ning Ke was just an ordinary student of the academy. They did not expect that he was the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. Thinking of the time when they met in the hot spring and fought side by side in the wilderness, they could not believe their ears. When Emo Shanshan heard the name, she looked at Ning Ke with a slightly stagnant look. Her hands, which were as steady as Xioshan, trembled a little. There was still no expression on her dull and slightly round cheeks, but a bit of fatigue suddenly appeared between her eyebrows. She put the small saber in her hand back to Zhuojihua's waist and sat back in the chair silently. Her lazy and listless eyes looked a little lost, and she did not look at Ning Ke again. Ning Ke did not notice the subtle change in the girl's mood at this time. After sitting down beside General Xu Cheng, he did not say anything more and just looked at the Revelation Department priest quietly. Because he did not look at Cuny Matty again, the noble aunt's expression became gloomier and gloomier. The Revelation Department priest also did not look at Cuny Matty. He looked at the snow-white silver hair floating in front of him and suddenly smiled. He quickly made a decision and looked at Ning Ke and said, "Mr. 13, how do you think this matter should be dealt with?" Ning Ke was slightly stunned when he heard the name Mr. 13. He thought that the bigwig of the Divine Hall had already known his identity in the frontier fortress of the north of Yen Kingdom. Then he thought of another thing and understood why. Once upon a time there was a mountain and there was an academy in the mountain. There was a headmaster in the academy, and he was the tallest person in the world. Perhaps this was just a saying to the people in the mortal world, but for the big shots in the cultivation world, especially those who knew a lot of historical secrets like the priest of the Divine Hall, it was an unquestionable truth. The headmaster of the academy was tall, of course, did not mean that he was tall. Although he was tall, it did not only refer to his high level of moral essays and ideology, but also to his high seniority. According to the childhood memories of the Haotian hierarch lord and the elder of Lank Temple, the headmaster of the academy had lived for at least 100 years. According to the headmaster of the academy's self-deprecating words, the longer one lived, the more advantage one would have, such as seniority. Therefore, there was no one in the world who was of the same generation as the headmaster of the academy. Even those who were of the same generation as the headmaster of the academy's disciples were believed to have died. Therefore, when Master Yensei talked with second brother Jun Mo at the back of the mountain of the academy, there was a dispute over seniority. Therefore, when the bigwigs in the Divine Hall and the Buddhism sect mentioned those people at the back of the mountain of the academy, they never referred to them according to the seniority of the orthodox sections. The academy itself had this problem. The seniority gap between the front yard and the back of the mountain was too big. In order to avoid the indescribable embarrassment, it formed a habit of addressing them. The instructors of the front yard called those at the back of the mountain according to the order of seniority, such as Mr. First and Mr. Second. This habit gradually spread to the outside of the academy, but because the people at the back of the mountain basically did not show up in the world, probably only the bigwigs in the Divine Hall still remembered this rule. Therefore, Ning Ke was Mr. 13. No matter in the military camp or in the world of cultivation powerhouses. Ning Ke was not a typical Tangs, but he had been in the army since childhood. Although he was no longer a small soldier in the border town, he still retained a lot of the aura in this aspect. What he hated most in his life was the bastards who did not help their comrades and robbed military merits. In the Dongsheng Stockade village, he knew that the cavalrymen of Divine Hall had robbed the military merits of the Blue Water Battalion. After entering the wilderness and experiencing the bloody battle, he did not have the slightest good impression of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall. Since they were Mr. 13, it was inevitable that he would have a 13th temperament. Therefore, even though he knew what answer the priest of the Revelation Department wanted to hear, he still did not follow the other party's instructions. The priest of the Revelation Department fell into silence. As an important figure in the Divine Hall, he naturally should protect the people in the Divine Hall. However, in recent years the Judicial Department had two famous people, the Tao Addict and Long Qing, and its strength had rapidly expanded. In addition, the Light Department had to keep a low profile because of the secret matter, so the Judicial Department was extremely arrogant from top to bottom. As the priest of the Revelation Department, he had long been dissatisfied. Today, Ning Ke dared to guarantee the Academy's reputation as the Divine Hall, so he took advantage of the situation to protect the Divine Hall's bright and fair reputation. He was not afraid of being criticized for damaging the dignity of the Divine Hall, nor did he care about being blamed by the Tao Addict and other people. With his mindset, he looked at Ning Ke and said with a smile, Chan Bachi, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, received 40 sticks and reported to the great divine priest of the Judicial Department to remove all of his positions. The cavalrymen will return to the Peach Mountain and be punished with hard labor for half a year. What do you think? This punishment did not include Cuny Matty, the flower addict and the students of the Revelation Institute. But it was natural, even the priest of the Revelation Department could not make any decision. Ning Ke knew that it was impossible to ask for more, so he nodded gently. Of course, he did not forget to praise the bright and righteous side of the Divine Hall. At this time, he was not reserved like a disciple of the headmaster of the academy. General Xu Chang gently stroked his beard and also agreed. So this matter came to a final conclusion. During the discussion, no one asked for Cuny Matty's opinion. Cuny Matty, who was sitting next to the Revelation Department, had a gloomy face. Her dry hands holding the chair were trembling. Of course, she was not afraid of anything, but she was almost unable to suppress the anger in her heart. Hearing 40 sticks, Chan Bachi, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, instantly turned pale. The stick was a special punishment instrument inside the Divine Hall. It was made of black pine wood and wrapped with fine steel thorns. It was said that countless years ago, the first great divine priest of judgment carried this stick for 20 years before he understood the meaning of Haotian. As a subordinate of the Judicial Department, he certainly knew this legend and how much pain this stick would bring to people. In the past few years he had followed Prince Long Qing to patrol around, arresting the remnants of the devil's doctrine and heretics. He had personally whipped those evildoers with the stick. He had seen the blood blooming on their backs and the vines entwined with tendons. He had never thought that such a thing would happen to him one day. He was a master in the see-through realm and had an important position in the Judicial Department. However, the hierarchy of the Divine Hall was strict. Since the priest of the Revelation Department had made a decision, he did not dare to resist. He did not even dare to argue or protest. He could only clench his teeth tightly and obediently let the steward of the Divine Hall drag him out. Cultivators in the see-through realm were very powerful, but their bodies were no different from those of ordinary people. Soon after the heavy muffled sound outside the tent, Chan Bachi, the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, finally could not help but let out a miserable howl. He wanted to clench his teeth and not cry out. He did not want to disgrace the Judicial Department. However, under the stick of the Judicial Department, even if he clenched his teeth, he could not resist the sharp pain. Everyone in the tent couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines as they listened to the muffled thuds of the cane landing heavily on their backs. They listened to the miserable howls, and could even faintly hear the hissing sound of the thin steel wires hooking out of their flesh. Listening to these voices, the girls of the Great River Kingdom pursed their lips tightly. Thinking of their younger brother who died under the meadow, they finally felt a little better after many days of depression. They could not help but look at Ning Ke, who was not far away, their eyes full of gratitude. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 237. After Chanbachi was carried back from outside the tent, no one dared to believe that he was the previous commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall with a solemn expression and the blessing of light. It seemed that whether it was the emperor or the saint, as long as they were stripped naked and had countless pieces of flesh torn off from their backs by the thorn cane, they could only be miserable criminals. The priest of the Revelation Department glanced at the badly mutilated body on the carpet. His expression did not change at all. He spoke calmly and sternly. The main meaning was, of course, to reiterate the teachings of the Divine Hall. He warned everyone that Haoyin's fair eyes were always patrolling the world, and those who dared to violate it would be punished. Ning Ke did not listen to him carefully. It was not that he had any bad feelings for this bigwig of the Divine Hall, or that he wanted to express his strong contempt for hypocrisy. In his opinion, sometimes hypocrisy was also a virtue. The reason why he could not concentrate was that the man lying miserably on the carpet was staring at him. Chanbachi, who was bleeding like a river and his muscles were strands, raised his head with difficulty. He stared at Ning Ke's eyes with his gray eyes without blinking. There was no emotion in his eyes, only indifference. However, it was this indifference that deeply showed his hatred for Ning Ke at this time. As the commander of the Divine Hall's apologetic Divine Army and a powerhouse in the see-through realm, he had never been humiliated like this. He knew that he was not qualified to hate the Academy, and it was even more impossible for him to take revenge on the other party. But at the same time, he believed that the two priests in the judicial department, especially Prince Longqing, would definitely stand up for him in the future. Therefore, even though he was already in a daze from the pain and his eyes were a little blurred, he still stared at Ning Ke because he wanted to remember this face and this person clearly. The matter of the horse gang on the meadow had been declared over with the severe punishment of the commander by the Divine Hall. Therefore, even if Chanbachi stared at Ning Ke could not do anything. Ning Ke could not be like those gangsters in the west city of Chang and beat someone up just because the other party stared at him. However, Ning Ke was not afraid of anything. He knew the hidden meaning in the indifferent eyes of the bloody man on the ground. So he slowly squatted down and stared back at him without hesitation. He said, "Commander, the way you stare at me makes me feel as if your eyes are piercing through me. It's a pity that you can't kill with just your gaze. You have to know that we were in the camp at that time, and we were the ones anxiously waiting for you on the meadow." Suddenly, he remembered that Master Yen Sei once described the real grand cultivators to him. For example, second brother only needed to glance at you and you would die. Then he thought that he had to rely on the waist token and the reputation of the academy, and the headmaster of the academy to bully others. He could only rely on his power but could not rise to power. He could not help but feel a little resentful. No one could sense Ning Ke's resentful mood at this time. On the contrary, many people in the tent were resentful because of his appearance. Especially when they saw the miserable situation of the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall covered in blood and rotten flesh. Ning Ke still lowered his body to continue to mock him. In the eyes of the disciples of various sects, he, a guy with fresh eyebrows and ordinary and amiable expression, was indescribably abominable. He was purely a scum who bullied others with his power. Aunt Cunimati could no longer suppress the anger in her heart. She slammed the arm of the chair heavily and snapped, "Enough." Ning Ke stood up and looked at Cunimati. He shook his head and said with a smile, "Not enough." There was a tense silence in the tent. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the young man with cute dimples on his cheeks when he smiled. They wished they could take a pair of scissors and pierce through his dimples. They thought that the Divine Hall had punished their subordinates and they all remained silent. Wasn't that enough? When I walked into the tent, I stopped Hill Master from challenging you to a life and death fight. It was a little rash to interrupt. The reason why I did so was that I thought you were old and weak. If Hill Master made a mistake and hurt you, it would inevitably cause gossip. But I didn't think it was wrong for her to do so. Ning Ke looked at the cold expression on the old woman's wrinkled face and the anger and contempt in her eyes. He thought of the scenes he had seen after he came to the frontier fortress of the north of Yen Kingdom. He thought of the despicable and shameless old woman who bullied others, framed others, and used her power and prestige to force the girls of the Great River Kingdom into danger. He frowned and said, I just think we should ask first. When the grain team camp was besieged by the horse gang, the cavalrymen of Divine Hall did not move. And you were also on the meadow at that time. Did you know that? If you knew, why didn't you do anything at that time? Without waiting for his voice to spread, he quickly continued to ask. It was the Divine Hall who was punishing its subordinates. Ain't you said enough? Can you also interfere in the affairs of the Divine Hall? If you can, why didn't you do anything on the meadow that day? Ninkei stared at Kunimati's old and slightly muddy eyes. His tone was extremely serious. Of course he was not joking. His puzzled expression seemed gentle and his words were neither fast nor slow, but his meaning was very tough. Aunt Kunimati trembled with anger. She did not expect that after Commander Chunbachi had paid such a bloody price, this new disciple of the Academy's back mountain would completely disregard the seniority of the elders and even want to teach her a lesson. The priest of the Revelation Department frowned slightly. In his view, even if Ninkei was the core disciple of the headmaster of Academy and might represent the attitude of the Academy's back mountain, the Divine Hall had already expressed its harmony with the humiliation and blood of a powerhouse. If Ninkei really wanted to spread the flames of war to Aunt Kunimati, it was something that the Divine Hall would never allow. The relationship between the Taoist power and the royal power of the Ueluan Kingdom, Aunt Kunimati's seniority and status in the cultivation world, and the power of the Buddhism sect behind her, meant that the Divine Hall had to protect her dignity. Therefore, the priest casually glanced in the direction of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom. Both the headmaster of Academy and the students of the second floor of the Academy rarely walked around the world. But today, the cultivation sects in the world still held the Academy in great reverence. Because there were many legends that began to circulate a long time ago. These legends were passed down from generation to generation in sects of various countries, and formed a certain way of thinking. In addition to the beauty of distance, it was easy to produce a sense of awe. The world had not seen the headmaster of Academy or the back mountain for a long time, and it had become increasingly mysterious and profound. Now they finally saw a disciple of the second floor of the Academy. But it was not surprising. He could not summon the wind when he opened his mouth and could not summon the rain when he raised his hand. Instead, he was extremely proud and mean. The respect caused by the mysterious and profound naturally faded. Especially the sword masters of South Jin Kingdom. They had the Sage of Sword Liu Bai, who was recognized as the strongest in the world. They were extremely proud and knew that this person called Ninkei was the culprit who killed a senior brother last year. It was more appropriate to say that they hated him rather than respect. Of course, the Revelation Department priest's glance did not mean that the Sword Master of South Jin Kingdom would jump out and kill Ning Quebec. The Sword Master of South Jin Kingdom would not do such a stupid thing. One only needed to think about the legend of Peach Mountain being cut empty to know that even if the Sage of Sword, Liu Bai, was here in person, he would not offend the Academy for no reason. A Sword Master of South Jin Kingdom said in a low voice, Mr. 13, you are not a member of the Divine Hall. What right do you have to care about the Divine Hall's affairs? The priest's gaze and the Sword Master of South Jin Kingdom had no respect for Ninkei, only hatred. These factors combined into a question and rebuttal. Of course, under the premise that no one in the tent dared to question the Academy, this was considered brave. This sentence was naturally aimed at Ninkei's words to Aunt Kunimati. Ninkei glanced at the Sword Master of South Jin Kingdom and shook his head, saying, Are you an idiot? As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he was stunned. Sang Sang had once asked him if he thought that everyone except himself was an idiot. He said that was because there were always many idiots doing idiotic things in the world. His favorite thing to do was to call countless people idiots in front of Sang Sang, such as the Tang Princess. He had once eavesdropped on the Tang Emperor calling people idiots in the imperial study, and he felt the warmth of a kindred spirit. He used to call Chun Pippi idiots on the letter paper, and he never got tired of it. It was just that, when he began to cultivate in the back mountain and gradually walked on the road to becoming a bigwig, he rarely had such a direct and straightforward way of doing things. That was why at this time he felt very familiar and missed the idiot ruler that he had not seen for a long time. He looked at the swordmaster of South Jin Kingdom and smiled. He continued in a gentle voice, "Are you an idiot? My master, Master Yen Sei, is the great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace. He is on an equal footing with the three great divine priests of Revelation, Light, and Judgment. As his only successor, if I don't do anything when I see someone tarnishing the divine hall's reputation, wouldn't I disappoint my master's earnest teachings and let Haotian down?" At this time, most people would probably turn around and ask the Revelation Department priest, "Your Excellency, do you think I should do anything?" However, Ninkei did not ask, because he knew that being arrogant and taking advantage of others was not a mistake. However, being too arrogant and taking advantage of others would only cause him more trouble. At present, the Revelation Department priest was obviously on an equal footing. He had been hunting in Min Mountain for many years, and he knew very well what to do when he encountered tigers and bears. Why would he do anything unnecessary? The sword master of South Jin Kingdom, who was full of courage and perseverance, was casually blocked by Ninkei's words. No one in the field questioned whether he was qualified to care about the affairs of the Divine Hall. Although the whole world knew that the West Hill Divine Palace's confirmation of the two great divine priests of the South School of Haotian Taoism was only based on political considerations, if they questioned this matter at this time, wouldn't it be a slap in the face of the West Hill Divine Palace? Aunt Cuny Maddie's face was extremely dark. She stared at Ninkei's eyes, and her body trembled slightly. Suddenly, she laughed hoarsely and unpleasantly, and said sternly, "A woman does not serve two husbands, but a disciple has two masters. I won't ask Yen Sei, but if I meet the headmaster in the future, I will ask him what he is thinking. Is he going to ruin his century-old reputation for such a naughty, despicable, and shameless disciple?" Although he did not say it explicitly, the hidden meaning in his words was directed at the two masters. Although Ninkei had not seen the headmaster of the academy, he had lived in the mountains for so many years. How could he allow anyone to be so presumptuous? Moreover, he knew that he could not punish this shameless old woman today. He was dissatisfied, but he could not do anything to her. He did not expect that she would come to him at this time. How could he not give her a hard kick? Ninkei's smile slowly disappeared, and he said calmly, "Previously, you asked who my master was, and said that you would teach me a lesson on behalf of my master. Now that you know who my master is, it seems that you still want to teach him a lesson." He slammed the table beside him heavily, and the table toppled over. The teacups were shaken away, and the tea splashed all over the sky. Ninkei pointed at Cuny Maddie's nose, and his expression changed rapidly. He said angrily, "According to seniority, you old woman should call me Marshal Uncle. How dare you teach me a lesson? Do you know what it means to respect the younger generation? Are you going to ask the headmaster? Is the headmaster someone like you can see whenever you want? You want to teach the headmaster a lesson? Do you want to deceive your master and destroy your ancestors?" When the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall stared at Ninkei, he thought that this was the biggest humiliation he had ever suffered in his life. At this time, Cuny Maddie pointed at Ninkei with a trembling finger, thinking that this was the humiliation she had never suffered in her life. However, just like the quiet court at this time, it only took the old woman a very short time to realize that there was no way for her to get back this humiliation today, because Ninkei did not reason with her at all. Ninkei was unreasonable. He only cared about seniority. As the sister of the Ueluan Kingdom's king, Cuny Maddie was extremely powerful, and her seniority in the Buddhism sect was indeed very high. In the past decades, whenever she met people who were weaker than her, she would use her strength to suppress them. When she met people who were more powerful, she would use her seniority to suppress them. In addition, everyone had to give her some face, so she was successful in every endeavor and gradually developed such a temperament. To put it in a good way, she abhorred evil, but in fact, she was arrogant, cold, and narrow-minded. She never thought that someone would use this kind of means to deal with her, and she could only listen obediently, because according to her usual speech and behavior, the other party did not do anything wrong. The seniority of the headmaster of the academy was indeed very high. Even she, the old woman with the highest seniority in the Buddhism sect, was only 2 generations lower than him. This also meant that if strictly required, she really had to respectfully call Ninkei uncle. She humiliated her uncle and questioned the Grandmaster. This seemed to be no different from deceiving the Grandmaster and destroying the Grandmaster's ancestors. Cuny Matty was so angry that she was a little out of her mind. Vaguely, she seemed to see those peers who were suppressed by her seniority, and dared not to raise their heads no matter how she scolded them. She thought to herself, "Am I going to suffer the same humiliation today?" She stared at Ninkei, and her skinny old hands hanging outside her sleeves trembled violently. There was a strong fluctuation of the chi of heaven and earth in the tent. Ninkei looked up at her condescendingly, with his hands behind his back calmly. There was no fluctuation of aura in his body. He did not need to say anything, and his meaning was clear. Hit me, hit me. Do you dare to kill me? If you really lost your mind and dare to hit me in front of so many people, I don't need to use eldest brother and second brother to kill you. I only need to send the 12th brother, Chan Pippi, to take a look at you and beat you up. Well, it's because your respected aunt has not yet entered the knowing destiny state. Ninkei looked at her and shook his head. He sighed and said, "As a mighty person in the Buddhism sect, you don't even know how thin your life is. No wonder you are so old and have not entered the knowing destiny state until today." Although Cuny Matty was a member of the royal family, she was persistent in cultivation, noble in status, high in seniority, and powerful in strength. The most painful thing in her life was that she could not cross the high threshold. Under the continuous stimulation, she was about to lose her temper and was on the verge of exploding. But she knew that she could not fight with Ninkei here, so she had been forcibly suppressing it. But she still heard such a sentence at the end. Aunt Cuny Matty forcibly swallowed back the blood that was about to gush out of her dry lips. She used the last of her consciousness to make herself blacked out. No one knew whether it was true or not, and then she fell backward. There was an exclamation in the tent. Requesting recommendation votes on Monday. Please support me. Last week I have been the first in the weekly recommendation. I hope I can continue to enjoy this comfort this week. Thank you very much. I can't repay you, so I will blow you a kiss. Mua mua. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Com to cast recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 238. Whether it was true or not, Aunt Cuny Matty was not feeling well and had to be helped out of the tent by the disciples. As for whether it was the occasional cold or the anger attacking her heart, one could guess it from the eyes of the monks from the White Tower Temple of the Ueluan Kingdom. Ninkei looked at the weak back of the old woman without any sympathy. He thought to himself, "Even I have not seen the teacher. How dare you accuse the headmaster of the academy? What kind of fool are you?" Thinking of the fool, he rolled his eyes and suddenly had the absurd idea of putting the big black umbrella on top of his head. He secretly thought that it seemed to make him more like second brother. Today's arrogance came from second brother's teachings. So although it was absurd, it was natural for him to have this association. From the legendary youngest uncle to second brother, senior brothers and sisters, and now Ninkei, the puppets of the academy, were proud and arrogant. The people in the tent were shocked and angry before, but when they thought of the stories that had been circulating for a long time, they had to be silent. The academy had the right to be arrogant. If they were weak, they would be bullied even if they were not arrogant. If they were strong enough, no matter how arrogant they were, no one would dare to do anything to them, just like Cuny Matty. Because of these things that happened before, the agenda of the meeting became much simpler. Ninkei did not listen very carefully. When he reacted, the meeting in the Divine Hall had ended and most of the people in the tent had left. The priest of the Revelation Department smiled and went to rest. General Shucheng looked at Ninkei and said with a smile, "Although I also know it is good to stay with fresh girls, since our army has a camp here and you have revealed your identity, do you still want to go to the barracks of the Black Ink Garden? It is not good for the imperial court." "Look at what you said. Of course I will go with you." Ninkei was a little embarrassed by the general's teasing. He knew that in many people's eyes, there was something wrong with him, a disciple of the second floor of the academy, to disguise himself and follow a group of girls from the Great River Kingdom all the way north into the wilderness. The female disciples of the Black Ink Garden were still surprised and surprised. They wanted to come forward to talk to Ning Ke, but thinking of his real identity, they did not dare to do so. Ning Ke smiled at the girls and was about to say something. Unexpectedly, Emo Shanshan stood up silently and walked out of the tent without saying a word. He could not help but be stunned. Zhuo Jihua sighed in her heart and smiled apologetically to Ning Quebec. She pulled Catgirl, who was eager to move forward, and bowed to the Tang army with her junior sisters. Then she followed Emo Shanshan out. Ning Ke couldn't help but touch his head, wondering what was wrong with the calligraphy addict. The Tang camp was quiet and the patrolling soldiers looked serious. Under the escort of several guards, Ning Ke and General Xu Chang walked slowly. No one dared to disturb them. The slightly cold winter wind blew the military flag above the camp. Ning Ke looked up and couldn't help but think of his life at the frontier fortress of the city of Wei. He missed it so much and was about to sigh with emotion. Unexpectedly, General Xu Chang looked back at him with a faint smile and said meaningfully, "The calligraphy addict is a good woman." Ning Ke knew that the general had indeed thought wrongly. He could not help but smile bitterly and was ready to defend himself. General Xu Chang shook his head and smiled. "Mr. 13, you don't have to say anything more. It is appropriate for the calligraphy addict to be a disciple of the back of the mountain of the academy. The Tang Empire and the Great River Kingdom have been on good terms for generations. I believe that both the Academy and His Majesty will be very satisfied with this marriage." Hearing this, Ning Ke suddenly understood why the general and the previous revelation priest looked so gentle when they said goodbye, as if they were matchmakers. With his current identity, it was no longer a purely private matter if he wanted to get married. At least he had to go through the imperial court and the academy. However, there were very few female disciples in the world who could match the identity of the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. Of course, the calligraphy addict was the best candidate. Ning Ke did not know how to explain. He really admired the woman who was addicted to talisman and stood on the branch in a white robe and blue belt. However, this kind of thing, no matter what it was after all his own business. How could it become a matter for others to discuss? In order to resolve the awkwardness, he changed the topic and said, "I thought that the priest would protect the dignity of his divine hall no matter what. I didn't expect that he was fair." The Revelation Department is in charge of the Revelation Institute, but Prince Longqing's experience in the Revelation Institute was not very pleasant. General Xu Chang said, "So the relationship between the priest of the Revelation Department and Prince Longqing has always been a bit subtle. Especially in recent years, the judicial department has become more and more powerful. Prince Longqing has become famous, and the Revelation Department has been under a lot of pressure." Ning Ke said with emotion, "I see. I didn't expect that there would be so much secular strife in a place like the Divine Hall. The Divine Hall shines brightly in the world, but the resources it can control are not infinite. The three great divine priests each lead a side, and of course there is competition among them. However, these three great divine priests are above the great gods, so naturally they can't fight like secular hooligans. The real competition is between the three priests." General Xu Chang continued to explain, "Among the two bigwigs of the judicial department, the Tao addict is obsessed with Taoism and doesn't care about specific affairs. So the divine priests and deacons of the judicial department, the apologetic divine army and spies are all specifically managed by Prince Longqing. If the Revelation Department wants to attack the arrogance of the Judicial Department, of course the first target is Prince Longqing." He looked at Ning Ke and said with a smile, "In spring you defeated Prince Longqing. In the eyes of many people in the Divine Hall, it was an unbearable humiliation, but the Revelation Department is probably grateful for your appearance." Ning Ke thought of the silver-haired priest of the Revelation Department and frowned slightly. He said, "How old is the priest of the Revelation Department this year? Is he stronger or weaker than Longqing?" If he could know this, he could roughly infer the true strength of the young powerhouses of the Divine Hall. The reason why he wanted to know this was that he always liked to see the academy and the divine hall as opposite. The priest of the Revelation Department, Chang Lishue, should be over 30 this year. As for the cultivation state, General Xu Chang shook his head and said, whether it is the military ministry or the Imperial Center Administration, they only have a rough estimate of the cultivation state of the people in the Divine Hall. Just like Prince Longqing, it is said that he is only one step away from the knowing destiny state, but no one knows how big that step is. Ning Ke stopped thinking about these issues and looked at a quiet tent in the distance. After a moment of silence he said, General, there is something I may need your help with. The disciples of the Black Ink Garden stepped on the withered winter grass and walked to their camp. Cat Girl looked at Ning Ke and the Tang General walking into the Tang camp. She reluctantly withdrew her gaze and frowned curiously. Teacher Zhong. No, the way senior brother Ning looked at Aunt Cunie Maddie just now was very strange. I don't know how to describe it. The girls thought of the previous scene. Aunt Cunie Maddie was trembling with anger and her face was dark. It seemed that she would go berserk at any time. But Ning Ke stood in front of her with a gentle smile. He did not avoid her and even looked up at her. They also felt that the temperament and taste that he revealed at that time were somewhat inexplicable. Catgirl bit her finger and thought for a long time. Suddenly she was enlightened and clapped her little hands excitedly. She looked at her senior sisters and said, I know senior brother looked really cheap at that time. Hee hee, but I like it. The girls of the Great River Kingdom were collectively stunned. Then they found that the word cheap was indeed the best choice to describe Ning Ke's expression at that time. They could not help but cover their mouths and laugh, saying that they also liked his cheap look at that time. Only Mo Shanshan, who was at the forefront, did not laugh. There was no expression on her silent face. Zhuo Jihua looked at her expression and gradually stopped smiling, revealing a trace of worry. Back in the tent, Mo Shanshan seemed to have completely forgotten the fierce conflict in the tent and the previous scenes. She calmly poured water, ground the ink in the brush pen, sat in front of the table and began to prepare to write. Zhuo Jihua waved her sleeves to signal her junior sisters to leave temporarily. She walked to the table and sat down on one knee. She quietly looked at the expression on her white cheeks. After a long time she softly said, Why did you leave like that before? Mo Shanshan's right hand holding the pen slightly stiffened. After a moment of silence she said, Then how should I leave? She was the calligraphy addict, the hill master with the highest status in the Black Ink Garden at the foot of Mogan Mountain. She was also the last core disciple of the master of calligrapher, Lord Wang. But she was not old. In Zhuo Jihua's eyes, she was more like a younger sister who was obsessed with calligraphy and didn't know anything about the world. Zhuo Jihua quietly looked at her and softly said, Mr. 13 has helped us a lot along the way. If he didn't show up in the tent today, I'm afraid there would be more troubles in the Black Ink Garden. Even if we don't mention the friendship built these days, you should say goodbye to him just to express your gratitude. Mo Shanshan gently turned her wrist and the soft brush pen touched the yellow paper. She wrote a horizontal line and lightly said, I haven't said it before. In fact, those horse gangs came because of him. In this case, we have no reason to be grateful to him. On the contrary, he dragged us down. It's natural for him to speak in the tent today. Zhuo Jihua looked at the crooked horizontal line on the table and couldn't help laughing. She immediately sighed softly and said, You know that's not what I want to say. Mo Shanshan looked at the ugly handwriting like earthworms on the paper and felt a little annoyed. She looked back at her and said, Then what do you want to say? Zhuo Jihua looked at her dark eyes with a little annoyance and said with a smile, What I want to say is that since you have secretly liked Mr. Ning for such a long time, now that you see him in person, why don't you make it clear? Mo Shanshan was slightly stunned. She turned back and continued to write with her head down. She said, I don't know what nonsense you are talking about. Zhuo Jihua smiled and said no more. She walked out of the tent and left her alone to think. Mo Shanshan didn't think about anything because the thoughts in her mind had become a mess. She just held the brush pen subconsciously and kept writing. Her thin lips were slightly open and she muttered to herself with annoyance, So you are that guy. But you have been hiding it from me. What do you want me to say? How can I be so cheap? As she muttered. The girl's eyes occasionally showed shame and annoyance. Her pink cheeks were slightly puffed and blushed. The ink on the yellow paper was dripping but tangled. Even when she was 3 years old, she couldn't write such ugly words. I had something to do yesterday. I make it up today. There's more. I'm writing slowly. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 239. I am the 13th. Miss, you can call me 13. You also know talisman? A little. Senior brother 13, you also know calligraphy? A little. Senior brother 13, what do you think of this chicken soup calligraphy? The brush strokes of this post are completely exposed and don't know how to restrain them. The form is scattered and the spirit is dead without a bone. Seems to have some new ideas, but in fact it's just some cheap tricks. It's evil with ink techniques, and it's not worth mentioning. The conversations on the journey kept drilling into Emo Shanshan's mind, like the cold wind in the wilderness entering the tent. Her dull eyes became more and more confused, even a little absent-minded. He was the 13th in the academy. Who else could it be but him? Besides himself, who else in the Tang Empire would despise the chicken soup calligraphy and the flower-blooming calligraphy? And that night, he admitted that he knew a little about talisman Taoism. Why didn't I think that he was him? Shanshan, you should have guessed it long ago, right? Emo Shanshan looked at the piece of paper on the table that seemed to be scribbled by a child. She reached out and crumpled it into a ball. She was so ashamed and angry that she didn't want anyone to see it. But she didn't know whether it was because of the scribbling or her confused mind. But no matter what, she was really angry at this time. They traveled together on the long journey and even traveled together in the same carriage. But she didn't know that he was him. She even said that she liked him in front of him, although he didn't know that he was him. And she didn't know that the person she liked was the one in front of her. But now she finally knew that he was him. Everyone knew that the calligraphy addict was quiet and virtuous, but she did such a thing. How could she not be ashamed? If that guy knew the truth, how could she not be ashamed? Senior sister Zhuhua even asked her to explain. How could she not be ashamed and angry? Her trembling fingertips pulled out the well-preserved copy from the table. She looked at the words on the paper. Her long and sparse eyelashes gently blinked, as if trying to cover the blush on her white skin. In the spring, there was news from the Tang Empire that shocked Chang'an. She knew that there was a young calligrapher who was deeply loved by the Tang Emperor in a distant foreign country. Out of habit, she naturally ordered the deacons in the sect to collect some copies. Although there was no legendary flower blooming, she saw the rubbing of this chicken soup calligraphy. It was said that the young calligrapher was accepted as the successor of the divine talisman master because of the chicken soup calligraphy. As a disciple of the divine talisman master Wang Sage of calligrapher, she certainly knew how strict the requirements of the divine talisman master for the successor were, so she carefully studied this chicken soup calligraphy for a long time. Like Master Yen Sei, she didn't see the potential of the writer to be a divine talisman master, nor did she cry like the girls in the House of Red Skirts because Master Yen Sei had scattered the meaning of the calligraphy. But she was not far from being a divine talisman master, so she could understand many meanings hidden in this chicken soup calligraphy. In addition, she also read many copies. She was proud, but she had to admit that the young calligrapher in Chang and was really good at writing. Except for her master, the master of calligrapher, there was no one else in the world who could be compared with him. When the details of the mountaineering competition on the second floor of the academy were spread to the Great River Kingdom, she was surprised to find that the young calligrapher had defeated Prince Longqing and became a student of the headmaster of the academy. She and the flower addict used to be good friends and often exchanged letters. So she was very clear that Prince Longqing was also a perfect person. But Prince Longqing actually lost to him, and even the headmaster of the academy accepted him as a student. So this person must be very good in terms of morality, bearing, and character. At this time, when she looked at the chicken soup calligraphy again, she found something different. It was a simple and sloppy note. Although the words and strokes were unorganized, there was a sense of great nature in it. It was so natural and open, as if Hao Ian's divine light had converged into a thunder in the clouds. The world should be like this. She was very curious about the situation under which the person could write such words. Because of some reasons she used to firmly believe that it was stupid to judge people by their words. But in this spring, she couldn't help but gradually have some different feelings for the young man in the distant Cha and city because of these words. This feeling was not complicated, but very subtle, very clean, and as transparent as crystal. She had only seen the person's words, but not the person herself. However, people who practice calligraphy could have a similar mind. When she looked at the person's words, she seemed to see the person. When she looked at the words, the person seemed to be beside her. From spring to summer, she had been quietly looking at the person's calligraphy beside the ink pool at the foot of Mogan Mountain. The legendary ink pool was black, but in fact it was clear and transparent, reflecting the stars in the sky and the girl's calm and smiling face. The person was behind her, looking at the calligraphy in her hand and her face reflected in the water. He did not speak and did not need to speak. He just quietly looked at the ink pool. Mo Shanshan looked at the rubbing of the chicken soup calligraphy. Her eyelashes slightly blinked, and the blush on her face gradually faded. The embarrassment in her eyes had already turned into confusion and uneasiness. Looking at the ink words for a long time, she whispered, "It turns out that you are you. Who is Sang Sang in the calligraphy?" "Young Master Sang Sang, I am drunk today. Is Sang Sang your little handmaiden? Has she been with you for many years? That's why you are so trusting, so natural, and so attached to her. Is this attachment out of habit or something else? Why didn't I hear you mention it on the trip?" "Yes, at that time you were still pretending to be someone else, so naturally you would not mention it. But Sang Sang, who is she?" Master Yensei could read Ninkei's mind from the chicken soup calligraphy. The girls from the House of Red Sleeves could feel the warm fragrance of the bowl of chicken soup at home from the calligraphy. But she could feel the importance of the name Sang Sang to the calligrapher from the rubbing. At this moment, Zhuo Jihua lifted the curtain and came in. Seeing Ninkei sitting beside the desk in a daze, she could not help but smile. This year she often looked at the hill master in a daze beside the ink pool, so others did not know that she had feelings for someone that ordinary people could not understand, but she clearly knew. "Let's read it after dinner and then think about what to do," she joked. Because of her close relationship with Zhuo Jihua, her feelings were discovered by Zhuo Jihua. That was why Mo Shanshan was a little shy and annoyed when facing her. Because of the name at the beginning of the chicken soup calligraphy, Mo Shanshan was a little uneasy and confused. Suddenly hearing Zhuo Jihua's words, she could not help but feel more ashamed. She had never been ashamed in her life because she had never liked anyone. But now her feelings were exposed by her close senior sister. How could she not be ashamed? She held her slightly round pink cheeks with her hands, blinked her sparse eyelashes, and pursed her red and thin lips into a straight line. Looking at the pile of luggage that was carefully arranged in the corner of the tent, she suddenly said with slight annoyance, "Send these luggage to him." Zhuo Jihua smiled and said, "I don't have time." Mo Shanshan turned around and looked at Catgirl who came in behind her. She said in a low voice, "Cat, you are familiar with that guy. Send his luggage to the Tang camp later." Catgirl scratched her head in confusion and asked why. Senior brother said he would come back later. Mo Shanshan frowned slightly and said, "There's no need to ask so many questions. He is a Tang man and can't live here. Just send his luggage over and we'll be even." The thin rubbing of the chicken soup calligraphy was still on the desk, and the faint figure was still on the surface of the ink pool. The tacit understanding of fighting side by side for thousands of miles was still in her memory. How could they be even after returning the luggage? Intentions were not luggage. Because they had no weight, it was difficult to lift and put down. At this time, Ninkei did not know that the girl in white in the black ink garden tent was ashamed and annoyed. She was preparing to clear up those shameful emotions and memories that outsiders could not know. If he knew the truth of the matter, he would be so excited and nervous that he could not speak. because although he was running away from the path of being a nobody, he did not have the consciousness of a big shot. The calligraphy addict secretly liked him? Damn it, what was the difference between this and Sister Butterfly liking him? Furthermore, it was Sister Butterfly who was dancing in tight panties. Because he did not know this, he was drinking tea and resting in a tent somewhere in the Tang camp. He looked very relaxed. After all, it was his own place. Both his mind and body could get a real rest under the protection of a sense of security. Unfortunately, he could not completely relax because he still had a very important thing to do. At dusk, a military order appeared in the Tang camp. General Xu Chang gathered all the departments and announced the results of today's discussion in the Divine Hall. At the same time, they discussed specific matters for the attack on the Desolate Man tribe next spring. The order from the middle military tent was a little strange. The main force in charge of attacking the Desolate Man tribe should be completed by the elite cavalry of the left king's palace. Even if the northeast border military of the Tang Empire would also participate in the battle, it was not up to these officers to discuss the war with General Xu Chang, because they were seriously not qualified. However, the military order of the Tang Empire was as important as a mountain. Although the cavalry stationed in the palace belonged to the northeast border military, since it was an order from the middle military tent, no one dared to disobey. With the dense footsteps, officers of all levels rushed to the middle military tent. The patrolling cavalry was also transferred, leaving only the defense force outside the camp. Ning Ke lifted the tent curtain and walked east in the empty camp. When he came to a place about 40 steps away from a tent, he stopped and reached behind him to pull out the big black umbrella that was tightly wrapped in cloth. The tent belonged to a deputy general of the northeast border military of the Tang Empire. There was a very faint smell of herbs and blood coming from the tent. If it were not for his 5 senses after cultivation, he would not have been able to smell it at all. After so many days, the bleeding has not completely stopped. I really don't know how you survived. Ning Ke thought silently in his heart. With a shake of his wrist, the big black umbrella opened with a swoosh. He held the big black umbrella and walked toward the tent. At this time the twilight was like blood, but the cloud above the camp began to snow. The snow was very small and sparse. A few snowflakes fell on the greasy and dirty surface of the black umbrella. It was somewhat beautiful. The small snowflakes fell on the surface of the black umbrella without any sound, and the sturdy leather boots stepped on the withered yellow barnyard grass without any sound. Ning Ke held the black umbrella and walked into the tent of the deputy general. A flash of a knife chopped down. The knife was round and as bright as the wind and snow. It was a scimitar. The people in the tent knew that Ning Ke had come, so Ning Ke could not sneak an attack. Ning Ke knew that there were people in the tent, so the scimitar was not a sneak attack. The front of Ning Ke's robe suddenly swung up, and his right foot popped out like lightning. It fiercely stomped on the thigh of the sneak attacker. With a muffled sound, the body of the sneak attacker bent like a shrimp. The scimitar in his hand chopped through the air and fell heavily on the ground. With a clang, the slender padao was unsheathed and turned into a bright color. It gently swept across the throat of the man, and blood sprayed out wildly, all the way to the top of the tent. There was a strong wind coming from the right. Ning Ke did not turn his head. He held the big black umbrella with 2 fingers, and a fu paper suddenly turned invisible. An inexplicable feeling of dryness appeared in the tent. The sneak-attacking horse gang held the machete tightly in both hands and pounced on Ning Ke with the momentum of the forward charge. His speed was extremely fast, as if he was going to split the big black umbrella and cut Ning Ke into 2 halves from top to bottom. However, when he rushed to the back of the umbrella, he found that what he had pounced on was not the big black umbrella, but a blazing white sea of fire. The flames in the air of the tent suddenly burned out, but the flames on the head of the horse gang were still burning. The scimitar in his hand did not cut the umbrella, nor did it cut the person, but only the air. Ning Ke had already turned around and waited quietly at the side. He looked at the face of the horse gang in the fire that began to deform and melt. He looked at the last terrified look in his eyes and watched his mouth open wide, wanting to cry out in alarm. He lowered his body and waved his knife. The blade flashed, and the burning head flew into the tent. The blood that sprayed out from the neck cavity of the horse gang sprayed to the top of the tent again, and mixed with the blood of his companions. Ninkei held the umbrella in his left hand and the knife in his right hand, and continued to walk silently into the tent. The headless corpse fell behind him with a thud. Under the umbrella, there was no emotion on his face. No matter in the past, present, or future, he had no mercy for these horse gang or those who pretended to be horse gang. The burning head of the horse gang rolled on the ground until it reached the inside of the tent. It stopped when it was about to reach a sleeping mat, and the flames with a burning smell gradually died out. A pale middle-aged man was lying on the sleeping mat. He was extremely thin and weak, and one of his shoulders was tightly bound with cloth. There was still some blood oozing out, and a faint smell of rotten flesh could be smelled. The middle-aged man stared at Ninkei, who was gradually approaching. Suddenly, his eyes shone and his body trembled violently. He seemed to be in extreme pain, but he was extremely determined. The chi of heaven and earth in the tent suddenly became chaotic, and a gust of cold wind rose out of nowhere. The snowflakes on the big black umbrella were instantly blown away, but the vigorous psyche power condensed from decades of meditation, and the determination at the last moment of life and death was completely blocked by the oily surface of the big black umbrella like the gust of cold wind. None of it could pierce into Ninkei's sense of perception. Since you have been ordered to kill me, you must be very clear about who I am. Ninkei walked to the pale-faced middle-aged man and looked down at him. He said calmly, I admit that your psyche power is indeed strong. But even if you are in perfect condition, how dare you hope to defeat a disciple of the second floor of the academy when I am prepared for it? Not to mention that you are now so seriously injured. Besides, do you feel that the wound on your broken arm is recovering very slowly? Even if you keep cutting off the rotten flesh, you still can't stop the wound from festering? In fact, that is because there is something on my knife. Ninkei raised his right arm and stretched the padao to the middle-aged man's face. The padao shone coldly. Except for those complicated talisman patterns, there was nothing special about it. The person who instigated you to kill me and yourself knew that I was a student of the second floor of the academy, and the successor of Master Yen Sei. So that day under the meadow you blocked several of my killing moves. But it is a pity that you don't know two things about me. Ninkei said, I have been hunting for a living since I was a child. I had to hunt big beasts when I was very young, so I occasionally used poison. My knife is smeared with snake thorn sap from Min Mountain. It is not very poisonous, but it is very troublesome. The middle-aged man lying on the mat was extremely pale. Because he had forced out the last accumulated psyche power in his sense of perception, he had no strength to fight back. Listening to Ninkei's calm narration, his eyes subconsciously revealed an expression of fear. As a cultivation powerhouse, he really could not understand why Ninkei, as a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, had hidden so many sinister and vicious tricks in addition to cultivation methods. I believe that you will no longer have any combat power at this time. But after all, you are a psyche master in the upper grade of the see-through state and a bigwig in the northeast border military of the Tang Empire. So I must remain vigilant. Then I am sorry. With these two words of apology, Ninkei once again waved the padao in his hand. The knife light suddenly flashed and disappeared. The middle-aged man did not die. But there was another horrifying wound on his shoulder. His last remaining arm was also separated from his body. The middle-aged man turned with difficulty to look at his shoulder. After confirming that both his arms were broken, he could not help but feel disheartened. Then he felt an unbearable pain rush from his shoulder to his brain, and he could not help but let out a shrill scream. Ninkei sheathed his knife and found a few pieces of old cloth in the tent. He stuffed one piece into the man's mouth and wrapped the rest around the wound on his shoulder. He was good at bandaging wounds, and with the addition of half a bottle of medicine, the bleeding quickly stopped. He lowered his head and seriously treated the middle-aged man's wound. At the same time he said, I have said before that there are two things about me that you don't know. Apart from the one that I have said, there is another thing, which is that I have a flaw in my character. Although I have started to cultivate, I am still not a person beyond the world. So there are many things that I can't mention or let go of. For example, I will definitely take revenge for the fact that you wanted to kill me, and also why you wanted to kill me. Ning-Kei finished bandaging and sat beside the middle-aged man. He took out the old cloth from his mouth and said, "You will definitely not be able to mention anything in the future, so you have to learn to let go, such as those stupid things like loyalty. If he wanted to extort a confession by torture, there was no reason to cut off the other party's arm. But he did it, directly forcing the other party into a desperate situation, and then began to ask questions at this time. It seemed like a cold-blooded and unreasonable behavior, but in fact it was very reasonable. How could a strong cultivator's heart be broken if it was not for this kind of cold and clueless mental attack?" The middle-aged man closed his eyes in pain. His dry lips were tightly pressed together, as if he was very afraid that once he opened his mouth, he would involuntarily say what Ning-Kei wanted to know. Ning-Kei looked at him calmly and said, "There is no use pretending to be desperate. As long as you are alive, there is still hope. After all, you are still alive at this time, so there are some things that you have to explain." For example, who are you? I am suitable to write romance. I like to write romance. Who can pay a high price for me to write it? I am very satisfied with the writing of this chapter. There are still 2,000 words left. I will continue to write seriously. I want recommendation votes. Also, it is the end of the month. I want the monthly votes that I have not wanted for a long time. End of exclamation mark. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 240. In the middle military tent, General Xu Chang was discussing with the officers of the Northeast Border Army. Suddenly, he felt the fluctuation of the chi of heaven and earth from deep in the camp and heard the scream. His expression changed slightly. A deputy general's expression suddenly tensed up as he stood up and prepared to rush out of the tent. General Xu Chang stared at him coldly and asked, "Suyin, what do you want to do?" The deputy general called Suyin turned around and looked at General Xu Chang, who was as cold as steel. He finally understood why there was such a meeting today. He forcibly suppressed the shock in his heart and explained in a low voice, "There is movement in the camp. Maybe enemy spies have sneaked in. As the deputy general of the mountain battalion, I should go and check it out." "No need." General Xu Chang's rank was far above Suyin. He looked at him expressionlessly and said, "The imperial court is carrying out a task. You don't need to go and check." Suyin felt as if he had been hit in the chest. He was worried about the situation over there and worried that if the imperial court was really investigating the horse gang, it might involve more people. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "Why don't I know what the imperial court is investigating? And now we are deep in the wilderness. Will the imperial court send people to investigate?" General Xu Chang slammed the table and shouted, "How dare you? Does the imperial court need to explain to a small deputy general? You shut up and sit down." The pale-faced middle-aged man was the leader of the horse gang who had ambushed the grain team in the wilderness. He looked at Ning-Kei's face with listless eyes and said weakly, "Since you can find me, why do you still ask who I am? I can find you because I have guessed your identity. But guesses are not valid after all." Ning-Kei closed the big black umbrella and continued, "It doesn't matter who you are. And it is easy to find out. I just need to draw a picture for the military ministry to check." The middle-aged man frowned painfully and said, "Then you can check? I can't go back to Chang, and now that I am in the wilderness, and even if I find out who you are, it won't help me with what I want to know. It's like if I break the law of Tang Empire and kill people, no one would dare to say anything bad about the headmaster of the academy." The middle-aged man slowly closed his eyes and said, "My name is Lin Ling, the commander of the Imperial Northeast Border Army's Inner Vanguard Battalion." Ning-Kei looked at his pale cheeks and repeated the name in his heart. Then he said, "Very well. Next, let's talk about who ordered you to kill me." The middle-aged man tightly pursed his dry, bloodless lips. It seemed that he wouldn't say another word. Since he was the general of the Inner Vanguard Battalion of the Northeast Border Army, then his immediate superior was General Xiahou. In fact, Ning Ke did not need to ask, and the middle-aged man did not need to say. They both knew who wanted to kill Ning Quebec. However, inference could never be turned into evidence. As Ning Ke had said before, the Psyche Master Lin Ling admitted his identity because he knew it was nothing. Ning Ke looked at the middle-aged man who had his lips tightly closed. He glanced outside the tent and saw a vague figure. After a moment of silence, he said seriously, "I swear by the headmaster's character that as long as you are willing to tell me who the mastermind is, I can let you go back alive and let the academy guarantee your safety." The Psyche Master Lin Ling opened his eyes and looked at him, but he still did not say a word. "I have already sworn by the headmaster's character. Do you still not believe me?" Ning Ke spread out his hands and said. Lin Ling said with difficulty, "No one ordered me. This is my own decision." "Even if it is your own decision, it must have been tacitly approved by someone. You should know that although you are a powerhouse in the see-through state, you are still not qualified to command more than 600 horse gangs in the wilderness." Ning Ke looked into his eyes and said, "I want to know that person's name." Lin Ling gasped and said, "Is it really so important to hear that name from my mouth? It may not be important to the investigation of the imperial court." Ning Ke paused for a moment and said, "But it is very important to me." Lin Ling suddenly laughed. His pale smile looked a little strange. "If it is very important to you, then why would I say it?" Ning Ke frowned and found that he had underestimated Xiahou's prestige in his heart and his loyalty. He gently stroked his knees and after a long silence, he suddenly asked, "Do you have parents or children?" Lin Ling seemed to have guessed what he wanted to say and said with difficulty with a smile, "No." In Ning Ke's eyes, this smile was very hateful and proud. After a moment of silence, he continued to ask with a gentle expression, "Then as a cultivator, you must have a master or a sect, right?" Lin Ling answered yes, but after I joined the army, I had little contact with the sect and I have no feelings for it. "You are lying." Ning Ke looked at him and said calmly, "If you have no feelings for the sect, you can let me have this empty door. But you are in a hurry to tear the sect apart, which proves that you have a strong intention to protect it." Lin Ling was slightly stunned and painfully frowned. He said, "Believe it or not, I won't say anything anyway." Ning Ke smiled and said, "Well, whether you are lying or not, you have to know what kind of crime it is to collude with the horse gangs to attack the grain team, especially to murder a disciple of the second floor of the academy." Lin Ling said calmly with a firm expression, "It is just death. Who doesn't die throughout the ages? Of course it is not as simple as death." Although I think that death is indeed the biggest threat, I know that loyal people like you have always thought that there are things in the world that are more important than life and death. Ning Ke looked into his eyes and said, "I'm a disciple of the headmaster of the academy and a trusted official of His Majesty. Based on this matter, I can punish your master and elders, disband your sect, and even kill all your relatives and fellow disciples. Maybe you really don't care about their lives, but what if your childhood sweetheart is among them? What if there's a senior sister who tucked you into bed at night? Wouldn't it be a pity if she died like this?" Lin Ling did not understand childhood sweetheart, but he understood Ning Ke's undisguised killing intent. So his body, which was cold due to excessive blood loss, became colder and colder, as if it was more miserable than the wind and snow outside the tent. "I am not used to threatening people like this because I rarely have the capital to threaten people before," Ning Ke said very seriously, "and I don't want to threaten people. I just want to know an answer. You and I both know this, but I want to hear the answer from your mouth." Lin Ling's skinny cheeks revealed a struggling expression, and his gray eyes gradually overflowed with feelings of abandonment and guilt. Ning Ke looked carefully and calmly at it. "I swear by the headmaster's character." After a long time, the dying Psyche Master finally slowly uttered a dry syllable from his dry lips. Ning Ke lowered his head and listened quietly, asking a few questions from time to time. After hearing everything he wanted to know, he stood up and looked at the dying middle-aged man, whose eyes showed some calmness and relief besides guilt. He nodded to show his respect. Then he pulled out the padao from the sheath and chopped down, and the cold blade cut the man's throat. The psyche master's complex emotions, such as guilt, relief and fear, all turned into gray shock and despair. His eyes were wide open, and he could not close them even if he was not breathing. Walking out of the tent, Ning Ke looked at the Tang soldier who was waiting for him and said, "It's really a pity that he didn't make it." This Tang soldier, who was an informant of the Imperial Center Administration in the Border Army, had seen what happened today from the beginning to the end. Hearing this, he did not know how to respond at all. Looking at the residual blood on Ning Ke's blade, he could only remain silent. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 241. Without breathing and unable to close her eyes, she died with everlasting regret. Ning Ke did not close Lin Ling's eyelids in the tent, so he did not feel heavy in his heart. He even quickly forgot about it after he left the tent. He had killed too many people in his life and seen too many dead people. He had also seen many people who died with their eyes wide open, so he didn't care at all. The resentment of the dead wanted revenge? If you can turn into a ghost, come on. Ning Ke never forgave those who tried to kill him. As long as he could achieve his goal, any oath or promise was the least valuable thing. He did not swear on his own character but on the headmaster's character because his character was not as valuable as the headmaster's. As for the headmaster's character being ruined because of his actions, anyway, the headmaster didn't know. Ignorance is not my fault. If others knew the truth, they would probably think that Ning Ke was immoral. For example, the spy from the Imperial Center Administration beside him looked nervous and uneasy. No one knew what he was thinking, because they did not know Ning Ke's nickname in the city of Wei, immoral. Ning Ke was such a person. But since he left the frontier fortress and returned to Chang, and with Sang Sang, he had no chance to show his wicked side. No matter how magnificent or bloody the things he had encountered and seen. The remaining leaders and leaders of the horse gang, who attacked the grain team and tried to assassinate him, were all dead. The middle military tent of the Tang army also went smoothly without any accident. This group of cavalry belonged to the Northeast Border Army, but General Xu Chang had come under the emperor's orders. As the commander of the cavalry, Deputy General Su Yin, who was suspected of harboring the horse bandits, had no way to resist and obediently allowed himself to be captured. General Xu Chang revealed Ning Ke's identity to investigate the horse gang case, which was one of the important reasons for suppressing the officers and soldiers in the camp. But the more important reason was the discipline of the Tang army. Although the Tang Northeast Border military had been under the command of General Xiahou for many years, it was still the army of the empire, not Xiahou's private army. Nowadays, the Tang Empire was powerful and the people from all over the world were loyal to the emperor. The idea of being loyal to the emperor was deeply rooted in the bones of every proud soldier. The people in Chang, and never worried that there would be any heresy in the four border armies. In the central military tent, Ning Ke told General Xu Cheng about the previous situation. Then he selected some of the secrets that Lin Ling had told him and asked the general's personal guards to record them into a book. They would send them back to Chang'an later. As for the spy from the Imperial Center Administration, he had already returned to his tent. There was another secret memorial, which would be sent to the nation advisor through the Imperial Center Administration, and then directly sent to the Imperial Palace. Therefore, Ning Ke was not worried that the horse gang case would disappear without a trace. At this time he was more worried about something else. Why did Xiahou want to kill him? Even if Lin Ling suspected that he was involved in the case of the censor and acted on his own, this reason was not strong enough. As a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy and a trusted official of the emperor, Lin Ling would have to take a great risk to kill him. If there was no motivation or inducement, why would Lin Ling cause trouble for his master? General Shuchong looked at him thoughtfully and thought that he was thinking about something else. He said slowly, although Lin Ling is a great psyche master of the Northeast Border military, this matter may not be able to be deduced to the general. After all, there is only one confession, and it was not recorded on the spot. Mr. 13, I am only responsible for reporting this matter back to Chong, and Ning Ke smiled to show that he understood. Even if his current status was extremely noble, this noble status belonged to the back of the mountain of the academy, and was not deeply involved with the secular world. It was really delusional to want the imperial court to punish a general of the army with just one sentence. Under the complicated gazes of the people in the military camp, he walked out of the central military tent and walked to his own tent. He had only taken a few steps when he saw a small figure running over from outside the fence. Catgirl's little face was slightly red. She panted and waved her hand saying, "Senior brother, your luggage is too heavy. I really can't carry it alone. Do you want to carry it yourself?" Ning Ke had originally wanted to move back to the Tang camp. After all, this was the place of his own people. However, today he had killed several horse gang members from the inner vanguard battalion of the Northeast Border military, which led to the arrest of the highest officer of this troop. Although no one dared to show any disrespect or hostility to him, the complex emotions in those eyes really gave him a headache. No need to move. He stretched out his hand through the fence and rubbed the little girl's head. He said with a smile, "I will go back to sleep at night." Catgirl was overjoyed. She clapped her hands and said, "That's great. Senior sisters all said that you would not come back." Oh. After the identity of the disciple of the second floor of the academy was exposed, the girls of Black Ink Garden thought that Ning Ke had no reason to stay with them anymore. He would definitely move back to the Tang camp. Perhaps it would be difficult to see him again. Thinking of the mutual support along the way, the jokes and the wild goats that were roasted golden, they could not help but feel a little regretful and sad. Therefore, when Ning Ke appeared outside the tent with the big black horse, he was warmly welcomed by the girls. Even the big black horse was touched by the soft and fragrant hands of the girls. It gently shook its head, kicked the hard ground under its feet, and turned its thick lips from time to time, looking particularly proud and happy. Only the calligraphy addict, Mo Shanshan, was as indifferent as before, or even more indifferent. Ning Ke walked into the tent and saw that she was writing small regular script with her head down. He said a few words to her but got no response. He could not help but feel a little strange. He walked forward to see what she was writing, but she glared at him coldly and stopped him. "I won't be angry with you for the sake of your poor eyesight." Ning Ke unconsciously comforted himself. He walked out of the tent and came to the side of the big black horse. He took out something that looked like a dry grass root and stuffed it into the big black horse's mouth. The big black horse's eyes suddenly brightened. It chewed and swallowed it down. Then it lowered its head and rubbed Ning Ke's face like a puppy, as if it wanted to ask for more. However, because its body was too big, it looked ridiculous even if it wanted to snuggle up to Ning Ke, not to mention that it was like a little bird leaning against a man. Ning Ke was too lazy to care about it. He annoyedly pushed its head away and looked into the distance covered by the dense clouds in the north. That was where the desolate man was. I couldn't help but look at that place quietly. I understood something. Many people were heading there. The imperial court and the academy did not send anyone there. He was the imperial court and the academy. Xiaohe wanted to do something there, and did not want the imperial court and the academy to interfere or know about it. That was why he did not hesitate to take a great risk to kill Ning Ke, because he was willing to fight to the death for that matter. In the desolate and cold wilderness, what could be worth the Zhenjuan general's fight to the death? Of course it was that tome of arcane. Ning Ke looked at the north of the wilderness and smiled. It started with the tome of arcane and it seemed that it would end with the tome of arcane. But he did not know if there was a good-looking vixen among the forces fighting for the tome of arcane. "I like your black horse." A voice suddenly came from behind. Ning Ke turned around and looked at the beautiful girl in white beside the big black horse. He looked at her red lips that were pursed into a straight line and her black hair that was neatly combed. He felt that there was a pause in the sentence he heard before, but he thought that he had heard it wrong. because her expression was still so dull, and her eyes were still so beautiful. But there was no charm or shyness in them. She was no different from usual. There are only 2,000 words today because the outline has been used up. I have to go and work on the latter part of the outline. I hope I can understand it as soon as possible. It also happens to be the confession day that happens once every 4 years. It is said that the girls confess today and cannot be rejected. So I have to confess to each other. It will be March soon. Please vote for the guaranteed monthly votes. I will not write a single chapter. If there are not enough votes, it will not be too late to write a chapter. Good night. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Lee May Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.